In the dark hours of the day, the young people enjoyed each other with passion. The young man slowly moved away from the young lady and called her. He looked at her intently and told her to stop. He asked her what they were doing now. The young lady sighed heavily and told her companion that he was, as always, ruining everything. Selena looked at him intently and said that the first time was difficult, but the second time was easier. He froze in embarrassment. She said that he liked everything that day too. He sighed heavily and said that they could forget that day. She looked at him intently and said that she wanted to do it again, and he didn't have to do anything at all. Selena looked closely at her companion and said that he could just lie quietly. The young man froze in embarrassment. The young lady was sleeping quietly on the floor near the fireplace, but suddenly she heard someone calling her. The man looked at her in surprise and asked why she was lying on the ground. She was puzzled because she did not expect her father to come to her. He asked angrily if she couldn't get up. He shouted that His Highness had ordered her to come to the palace. He told her to hurry up and start getting ready. He didn't understand why she was acting like this. She sighed and said that today's ritual had been more difficult than the previous one, and she still hadn't recovered. He shouted that he wasn't interested in excuses. He looked at her with fury and said that if she didn't want to be pulled by the hair again like she had been when she was a child, then she should get up right now and start getting ready. He looked at her intently and told her to dress appropriately. She didn't answer. He looked at his daughter with contempt and said that she should not disgrace their family. A moment later, a maid entered the room and called the young lady. She looked closely at the lady and asked if she was very tired, and she also offered to help in the preparations. The young lady was a little puzzled as she was not feeling very well as the winter was hard and the ice wall wanted more energy. Selena thought that this time she would succeed, but unfortunately, it was not so. The maid asked if the ritual was really about using the blessing of the ice goddess. She really wanted to know what was already beyond the ice wall. The young lady said that no one knows, but it is certain that if the ice wall collapses, the kingdom will suffer a great disaster. The maid said it must be very difficult for her to maintain the huge ice wall every winter. The lady sighed heavily and said that thanks to this power, her family received a powerful blessing. The maid looked at her mistress sadly. The maid looked at her mistress with excitement and said that she could tell His Highness that she would come to him next time. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she could not do that since he had called her, so there must have been a reason for it. The maid looked at the young lady and said that he also invited Duke Millard. Selena froze in shock on the spot. The maid smiled and said that the Duke and His Highness had known each other for a long time, and they had all studied together at the academy. The young lady sighed heavily as she knew that everyone misunderstood their relationship since they were only students at the academy, but were not friends. She knew perfectly well that His Highness was aware that she and the Duke did not get along with each other. From an early age they were at odds with each other, and the prince was a witness to this. The prince looked at the Duke and said with a smile that after today's graduation, if nothing bad happened to the kingdom, he would never call them. He smiled and said that in one place they would bite each other's throats. He looked at them with a smile and said that they should pray that they would never meet in the same place again. The prince, sipping tea, said that the lady would soon be there. The prince looked at the Duke and said with a smile that after graduation, he would soon meet the young lady for the first time. The prince smiled and looking at his friend said that he did not expect that he could be so embarrassed. He looked at the Duke intently and asked if he hadn't said that he would only call them both in an emergency. The Duke was taken aback and stood frozen for a moment as he realized the gravity of the moment. Sometime later they were informed that a young lady had arrived at the palace. She entered and greeted them with a smile. Leonardo greeted her and also said that she was probably very tired after the ritual. The Duke looked at her intently. The young lady looked at the prince with a smile and said that she was fine. The Duke was shocked and could not believe that she was wearing clothes that were not appropriate for the season. He looked at her puzzledly and called out. The prince looked at her with a smile and said that it was very cold outside and asked why she was dressed like summer. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he really thought so. The prince smiled and said that it was cold now because it was winter outside. A moment later, the young lady was taken aback as a jacket flew into her hands. The Duke looked at her intently and casually said that she should cover herself with it. Selena asked him if he didn't like her clothes. She said that her bare shoulders were quite attractive. After her words, a discussion began between them. The prince sighed heavily and told them to stop. The prince looked intently at the young people and said that he had one request for them. Even though the prince is a bastard, he was still born in the palace and grew up as a prince his whole life, so this is not a request on his part, but rather an order. The prince looked closely at the young people and with an innocent soft smile said that the two of them should get married. The young people froze in shock as they had not expected anything like this at all. They looked at each other and irritably asked the prince if he really wanted them to get married. The prince smiled and said that everything was exactly like that. He began to tell the true reason for their marriage, but the young people did not let him speak. He looked at them with a smile and continued speaking again, but they kept interrupting him. He looked closely at the young people and sighing heavily said that they should stop. He looked at them intently and with a hint of irritation in his voice said that he wanted to finally explain everything to them. The prince said that they knew that the king would soon hand over the throne to the crown prince. He sighed heavily and said that everyone knew perfectly well that his mother was a commoner, and therefore it was a great topic for gossip. The lady looked at the prince in surprise and asked if this was the reason why the throne would not be given to him, but to his brother who was not at all experienced in this area. The thing was that the prince was in no way inferior to the crown prince and was even better, and everyone knew about it. The duke sighed heavily and said that the young lady was right since the crown prince was not so clever in matters of politics and he did not enjoy the king's trust. But everyone knew that he had won the trust of the aristocrats and they would all prefer to have a man on the throne who could be controlled. The prince sighed heavily and said that he would only have the support of a small number of aristocrats and he hoped that they would support him in this. With the ability to manipulate ice, Lady prevented the huge ice wall on the estate from collapsing. The duke possessed fire and he lit a fire to warm the particularly cold estates. The prince said that if he could secure the support of two families who owned most of the kingdom and had the blessing of the goddess, he could suppress all the nobility. Selena shouted at the prince that she was already on his side, and for this reason she thought that they did not need to get married. He looked at her and said that he understood perfectly well how she felt, but she was on his side, not her family. He looked closely at the young lady and sighed heavily and said that it was she who should not go against the will of her family. He said that if she were to carry another name from the family that supported him, then no one would be able to do anything. The duke looked at the prince with puzzlement and asked if this was the only possible way. The prince looked at them intently and said that this way was the safest and most effective. For this reason, he was ready to beg them. He said it was to create the perfect world they dreamed of. The duke said that, in theory, their marriage contract would help him become king. He sighed heavily and said that he didn't think it would make much difference anyway. The young lady sighed and said that she hated to admit it. But the duke was right. As she left, she said that her family's relationship would not change if she got married. She said that they should simply forget about this idea. The prince said they should talk about more than just marriage. Selena said if it wasn't important she was leaving. He said it was very important. The young lady in turn sighed heavily, but still decided to listen to the prince. He looked at them intently and said that he had not expected them both to refuse so stubbornly. He looked at them intently and asked why they hated each other so much. Selena said with a smirk that he knew better than anyone in this country how arrogant the duke's family was. The duke looked at her intently and said that she should look at her family first before speaking such words. The prince smiled and said that it was no secret that their families had been enemies for generations, but there had been times when they had been good friends. He looked at them with a smile and said that they seemed to get along very well in their youth. The young lady in turn furiously shouted at the prince not to remember senseless stories. With lightning speed, she stood up and walked towards the door. She said that she was very tired after the ritual and wanted to rest. The duke shouted for her to stop as they were not finished. The duke asked the prince for forgiveness and said that he would step away for a moment. The prince looked at the duke with a soft smile, thereby allowing him to follow the lady. The duke shouted after the young lady to stop. The prince knew that Selena had a sharp character due to the fact that she had to survive under the oppression of her father. The duke became so irritable only in the presence of the young lady. The prince sighed heavily. He was puzzled and did not know how to convince them. He wondered if they didn't understand that he only wanted them to marry for his own purposes. They had to get this matter over with as quickly as possible. The man looked closely at the little children and said that the sun was already setting and it was time for them to go home. The boy smiled and said that he would like to play some more. The man said that if he was late, his parents would scold him. With tears in their eyes, they looked at the man and said that they wanted this. He smiled and said that they should go home. A moment later, the children said goodbye to the seller with a smile who looked after them intently. A few minutes later, he was taken aback and turned around because he heard someone scream. He looked into the distance because he knew that there had been an increase in kidnappings recently, and no one was allowed to wander the streets at night. The man slowly walked into the dark alley. He was a little puzzled because he smelled a strange smell. The man in turn thought that the children were playing a joke on him. He shouted and called the children, but suddenly froze as he noticed some silhouette. He looked at the man excitedly and asked if he had seen the children who were passing by. He sighed heavily and said he wanted to take them home before it got dark. A moment later, he froze in place. He was shocked because he saw a truly terrible sight. The man was surprised and did not understand what he was seeing. He asked the man if everything was okay with him, but he only growled at him in response. He was taken aback and began to slowly walk back. He shouted at the man not to come near him, but a moment later a terrible scream was heard in the alley. Selena smiled and told her friend that he was very slow. He smiled and asked where she was going in such a hurry. Selena said with a smile that they were going to have a picnic. Now she was taken aback as one bun fell on the ground. She said sadly that she couldn't eat it now. Millard agreed with her. A moment later, he said with a smile that she should look at the bun. He said with a smile that the ants ran up to their bun and it was very funny. He said with a smile that they had a lot of food and they could share it with the ants. She looked at him in surprise. A moment later, she sat down on the ground. He looked at her worriedly and asked what she was doing. She sighed heavily and said irritably that they were stealing their food. He was taken aback as he did not expect such a thing from her. He came closer to her and said with a smile that the ants were hungry and she could consider this as charity. She didn't understand how she could share with someone what belonged to her. She knew it was just a waste of food since the bun was hers to begin with. She didn't understand why she had to share. Selena knew that she never knew when she might die of hunger. She understood that her friend never went hungry. She understood that if she were as well off as he was, she would behave the same way. She knew that if she were the daughter of a duke, everything would be different. She knew that if they were to switch places, she might be as generous and kind as he was. A moment later, she said that she was not having fun outside and wanted to go back. He was surprised as they were going on a picnic. He asked with a smile what they would do. Selena said that they could play in the room. She was taken aback when she heard her father's voice and froze for a moment. She walked closer to the open door and realized that there was a meeting today. The men discussed their children because they thought they would end their long war. The young lady froze for a moment as she realized from their long conversation that they were simply using her. Millard looked at his friend with excitement and called her. She pushed him away and said that she didn't want to play with him anymore. He stood frozen in surprise, not knowing what to say. She knew that the more time she spent with him, the more jealousy and envy consumed her. She realized that this made it obvious to her that she was simply being used, and she did not want to spend any more time with him. While studying at the academy, everyone was talking about her. They said that she was the illegitimate daughter of a duke. Since her mother's origin was unknown, they thought that she was a commoner. The young lady was furious, for every year she heard the same gossip. She shuddered when she heard Millard's name being called. The young man looked at everyone with a smile and answered everyone. She looked closely at the young man as she understood that they both possessed the power of a goddess, but at the same time the attitude towards them was different. Millard ran after the young lady in a hurry and called her, but she did not stop. He sighed heavily because he knew that as soon as her family history came up, her character became more acute in another way. The men looked closely at the young heirs. They said that it seemed that the relationship between the families remained the same. They whispered and said that if these families became friends and united, then this fact would be a shocking blow to the kingdom. They said that the late Duke Eckhart and his wife were descended from the Sturt family. The Duke looked at them with fury and said that they were talking unthinkable nonsense. The young lady looked at him and told him not to be angry, as people's words had no effect and his actions would not change anything. He looked at her hard and said she was right. She said she hoped the prince would take their decision calmly. He looked at her intently and said that he was actually ready to agree. She looked at him intently and said that their marriage would not happen. Selena said that since they had at least agreed on something and he had nothing more to say, she was leaving. She said that the coachman was already waiting for her. The young man was taken aback. He looked at her carriage in surprise and asked if she had really arrived to the palace in it. She calmly said that it was true. Selena looked at him in bewilderment and asked, what was the matter? She was surprised as he ran to the carriage. She was taken aback and asked what he was going to do. The young lady and the coachman stood frozen in shock. He looked at her intently and said that her carriage was out of order and she had no choice. He looked at the young lady with a beaming smile and said that he would give her a ride home. Sometime later, the young lady was riding home in a carriage with the Duke. She looked at him hard and told him that he was crossing a line and that he didn't need to worry about her or feel sorry for her. He asked her in surprise what she was talking about. He wondered if she thought he had given her a ride because he felt sorry. She asked him in surprise what difference it made to him, whether she rode home in a broken carriage or not. He said that she was thinking about the wrong thing. He said that she was an honored guest at the royal palace, and if she left in a broken carriage, unwanted rumors would spread. She sighed heavily and said that there was some logic in his words. He said that he was completely logical. She said her estate was far away. He said he had a friend nearby whom he needed to meet, so everything was fine. She said he was a good liar. He smiled and asked how she could know since she had no friends at all. She was taken aback. He sighed heavily and said that it was exactly like that. She looked at him in surprise and asked how about graduation. Then she wanted to say goodbye to her only friend, and so she came to the prom for him. Then she asked if he wanted to have a drink in her room. They hesitated, looking at each other as they remembered that day. A moment later, they both looked at each other embarrassed. A moment later, the carriage ran over a rock and the young lady jumped. Millard shouted at her to be careful. But a moment later, she fell into his arms and froze. She looked into his eyes intently as he was very warm, just like that day, and for some reason, she didn't want to let him go. The young lady nevertheless pulled away from him and, asking for forgiveness, said that she had slightly lost her balance. He sighed heavily and sheepishly said that everything was fine and she didn't need to worry. She was excited and didn't understand what was happening because she had decided to forget about that day and end it all. She didn't understand why she felt that way. The Duke in turn looked away from her in embarrassment. Sometime later, after a long journey, they finally arrived at the young lady's estate. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that whatever the reason, thanks to him, she got there without any problems. She looked at him and thanked him. Looking away, she said that now she had to go. She froze for a moment when she saw her father running towards her. He looked at them with fury and asked what was going on. He was furious and did not understand where her carriage was and why she had arrived with the Duke. She looked at him and, trembling, said that she would now explain everything to him. He shouted that he didn't need her excuses at all and that she should go home. The young lady in turn wanted to tell him everything he asked, angrily, if she really wanted to contradict him. He raised his hand to her in a rage. The Duke quickly stood between them. He was surprised that her father was personally meeting his daughter. He asked with fury if he really wanted to yell at her and even raised his hand. A moment later, he explained the whole situation. He said with fury that it seemed that the relationship in their family towards the heirs had worsened. He said with fury that he had drawn conclusions. Moments later, he told his girlfriend that he was already leaving. As he left, he turned and looked intently at the lady. The Duke asked her how long she intended to live like this. He asked with cold fury if this was what she really wanted. He looked at her intently and said that it was time for her to think about it. She did not answer the Duke but was furious because she did not want such a life. She knew that he was right to some extent, but he did not know everything. He looked at the coachman and asked if he was in charge of the carriage today. The man said that was exactly the case, but he would like to explain the situation. The Duke did not let him say anything. He furiously threw the coachman to the ground and began to beat him. The young lady was shocked. She screamed and called her father. A moment later, she directed her ice magic at her father, and he threw the cane from his hand. He looked at his daughter with fury and asked how she dared to use her power on him. She looked at her father intently and told him to stop, as the coachman was not to blame for anything. She said that the carriage was broken, and for this reason she accepted the Duke's help. He looked at her with fury. The Duke looked at his daughter with fury and insulted her. Selena in turn. looked at her father with fury, and immediately her power surrounded her. He looked at her in surprise and wondered if she had really begun to fully control her power. He looked at her and said that it seemed like she still didn't realize who was keeping her little brother alive. He asked her angrily if she knew how much the medicine he bought from the magic tower cost. The Duke said that if her brother stopped taking his medication, he would soon die. A moment later, she asked her father for forgiveness. He sighed heavily and said that he knew that there was a drop of common sense left in her stupid head. He said that she should behave calmly. He walked slowly into the house, burning with anger. He was furious and did not understand how she dared to rebel against him. The man brought the young lady to the estate and said that there were rumors in the village that she had used the power of a goddess. He looked closely at the girl, as it was easy for him to understand that she had had a difficult life. He thought that he should take advantage of this chance. He smiled tenderly and said that he missed her very much. Selena looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand why he said such a thing. He smiled and said that he was her father. Sometime later they trained her strength. Selena spoke excitedly that it was very difficult for her, and she would like to return to her family as she missed them very much. He smiled and said that if she tried hard enough, he would bring them to live in the estate. She said that she did not like it and did not want to do such things. Unable to bear it, the Duke shouted that if she didn't try, her mother would die. She froze in shock. She screamed with tears in her eyes that he had deceived her. She screamed that she could not see her mother because she was sick, but if she tried hard, her mother would get better, and she would see her. She used her power against them with fury, and they were shocked by what they saw. The Duke was surprised because he didn't expect her to be able to release all her power. He froze in shock as he was amazed by her capabilities. She recalled her father's words, who said that her mother had unfortunately died, but he was doing everything possible to get medicine for her brother. She thought about the Duke's words for a moment. Selena was very excited and confused by the whole situation. She knew that as the Duke had said she had catastrophic power, but she knew that the department was not quite within her power. She remembered her father screaming furiously at her to freeze everything immediately. The maid looked at the young lady in surprise. Selena asked the maid what happened. She said that the Duke was calling her to that room. She sighed heavily and said that she understood everything. The maid told the mistress that she looked tired and suggested that she reschedule for next time. Selena said that she was fine, and looking at the maid, she said that she knew everything perfectly well. She said sadly that unfortunately no one can disobey her father. She looked at the maid in surprise and asked if she really wanted to go that far. Anna sighed heavily and said that the fireplace was not burning. They thought that the Duke's strength seemed to be exhausted. Anna said that the Duke had come to them, and therefore the gentleman had conveyed a message to her. Anna looked at the lady intently and said that Duke Eckhart would be accompanying her today. The lady was surprised. Taken aback, she looked at the maid and asked what she had just said. She looked at the maid with anger and asked if father really said that. The maid said that they had received a message from the palace. She said that the prince would join them for today's ritual. In other words, the Duke and the prince would accompany her. The young lady was furious as she knew perfectly well that the prince had made it all up. She looked at the lady with concern and asked if she should tell the master that she was ill. Universe said that her father would not listen to the request. The prince looked at the lady intently and said with a smile that he thought she would not come. She sighed heavily and looking at him said that she simply would not dare to do such a thing. He smiled and said that it would be nice if she complied and accepted his proposal. She sighed heavily and said that she was not ready to graduate with such shame. She knew that if a prince had a goal, he would always strive forward, not noticing anyone around him. She knew that if she had told them that she was ill, they would have come to her bedroom with the Duke. A moment later, the Duke approached them and asked what they were talking about. He said that the ritual was about to begin. The prince looked at the Duke with a smile and asked if he was ready. He sighed heavily and said that he was ready. The young lady said that they should start quickly, as when the sun sets on her estate, it is simply unbearably cold. She said, looking at the Duke, that she did not want to make her servants in the house shiver with cold. The Duke said that she should not rush him. He said that he had to concentrate and not be distracted by anything. The young lady in turn looked at him intently. She wished he would stop being so grumpy at every ceremony. She felt like he was acting like a grumpy cat. She looked at the prince intently and asked why he was present at the ceremony. The prince looked at her intently because he understood that she was the daughter of a duke, and everyone in the estate must obey her. He looked closely at everyone present and realized that they were subordinate to Duke Anna, and there was a high probability that she was an empty phrase for them. He understood that when she was near the Duke, she did not want to show the whole situation in which she had lived her whole life. He looked at the young lady intently as an idea came to him. He said that he was doing her a favor and she would have to repay it. The young lady in turn was shocked. She screamed that this was too much on his part. He began talking about their marriage again with a smile and a moment later said that he would not talk about it anymore. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he was sure he wouldn't bring this topic up again. He smiled and said that he was right and they needed to start the ritual. The young lady sighed heavily and agreed with him. The prince looked at her with a radiant smile. He said that when everyone left, it became too quiet. He smiled and said that he could step aside and she could talk to the Duke. In the very center of the estate is a large pillar of fire warming the entire territory in the same way that the Stuarts perform a ritual to maintain the ice wall. Eckharts also perform rituals to infuse power into Selena. The young lady was alarmed. She looked closely at the Duke as she did not understand what was wrong with him. It seemed to her that he looked as if he was ill. She knew that if he continued in this state, he would put himself in danger. She knew that he had to stop the ritual. Leonardo said excitedly that if the Duke continued, he would put himself in danger. He said that the ritual had to be stopped. Selena agreed with the prince, but she understood that it was very dangerous to stop the ritual halfway. Selena knew that every cell in her body would experience unbearable agony. She knew that this pain was incomparable to anything. Selena knew that if she continued the ritual, Millard could be completely consumed by the fire. She just couldn't let him die. She glanced sideways at the prince and said that she had thought of a way to deal with this. Selena looked at him intently and said that she needed to use her powers for a while. She asked the prince not to be surprised. The young lady in turn was lying quietly on the sofa when she suddenly heard someone calling her. She slowly rose and saw the prince approaching her. He said with a smile that she had done a good job. She sighed heavily and said that she had done nothing special. He smiled and said that it was comparable to a feat and she did not need to be modest. He said she built a huge ice wall. Selena said it was the only way to get rid of unwanted looks. She said it took a lot of effort to pull the Duke out, and even though she wrapped her body in ice, it was too hot. He smiled and said that he could let her rest as much as she wanted if she did him a favor. She sighed heavily and said that they had already decided everything she asked him to stop because she was tired. He said that she could fulfill his request. She sighed heavily as she did not think that everything would turn out like this. He said that the Duke still hadn't woken up, and his body temperature was still rising, so he wanted her to take care of him. She was puzzled because she knew that she could freeze the man to death with her own hands. She had never saved anyone. She sighed heavily and said that she couldn't do it. The prince looked at her in surprise. Looking at Selena, the prince asked if she didn't want to do this because she loved the Duke. She was shocked because she didn't expect to hear something like that. The prince looked at her closely and said that if she couldn't do anything, she could at least get the Duke's fever under control. He looked at the young lady intently and said that this was his request and order. The young man was puzzled because it was too hot and he did not understand where he was. He wanted water very much. He was in shock and it felt like all the blood was evaporating from his body. He felt very hot and painful, but a moment later he felt cool. He turned around and saw a snowflake. The Duke was a little surprised as he did not expect such a thing. A moment later he walked slowly into the cold and suddenly heard someone's voice. He woke up because he heard the voice of a young lady. Opening his eyes, he saw small snowflakes in the air. A moment later he was taken aback as he did not understand where he was now. With the speed of lightning he sat down on the bed. He was excited and didn't know what had happened, as the last thing he remembered was the ritual. He wondered if he had passed out since he had little memory of what had happened. He knew that the prince could not help him in the ritual since he was a commoner. A moment later, the Duke saw a young lady sleeping quietly next to him. He was very surprised because he did not understand what she was doing next to him. He looked at her closely and wondered confusedly why she was dressed like that. He knew she was a girl in full bloom. A moment later he looked up and saw snowflakes in the room. It seemed to him that all this time he had been dreaming in which he was in a hot place, and the lady helped him. He sighed heavily as he realized that he was now in her debt. A moment later he picked her up in his arms and carried her to the bed. The Duke slowly laid the young lady on the bed and looked at her intently. He slowly approached her face. He saw how she slept quietly. Some time later, the prince entered the room and with a satisfied smile told her lady that he had figured out how to help the Duke. The prince froze in shock when he saw the Duke in a very interesting position. The Duke in turn was taken aback and called the prince. He was surprised that he had come into the room. The Duke in turn froze in place. He did not know what to do in this situation. The prince looked at the Duke with a satisfied smile and said that it seemed that he had not chosen the best time to visit. They argued with each other for some time when suddenly the young lady opened her eyes and looked intently at the Duke. The Duke in turn was taken aback and called the young lady. The young lady in turn stood frozen in stupor, but a moment later she screamed. The Duke said she had got it all wrong, but she pushed him away and screamed that he was just crazy. She screamed that she had saved his life, and he thanked her in a similar way. He screamed for her to listen to him. The prince looked at everything that was happening with a smile. Sometime later, they sat and drank tea, the prince looking at the young people with a satisfied smile. He smiled and said that this situation showed that they were very close to each other. The young people looked at the prince with fury. A moment later, Selena told the prince that they could discuss what happened in the tower. She looked at the prince in surprise and asked why everything boiled down to the fact that they should get married. The prince handed them a document to look at. She knew it was a magic item, the scroll of silence, but she didn't understand what exactly he wanted to tell them. He looked closely at the young people and said that news had reached him about a banquet being held in the magic tower. The Duke asked the prince if he was bothered by the excessive conservatism of the magic tower. The prince said that he was right about that. The prince said that each delegation should be made up of a married couple. The Duke looked at the lady and said that they were not ready to have a wedding and suggested that the prince choose someone else. The prince looked at his friend in surprise and asked if he understood what nonsense he was talking about. The prince looked at him intently and said that he was a duke, the most noble in the kingdom, and few aristocratic girls were worthy of receiving the title of his wife. The prince said they had no time. The Duke was puzzled as time was running out, and they had no worthy candidates. He was indignant for a while. The prince smiled and said that this was his desire, and he did not understand why he should look for another candidate if they were suitable for each other. She looked at the prince intently and asked if he really meant to say that it was all about the magic tower. She asked if they could get divorced afterwards. The prince said that they didn't need to get a divorce because if they did everything right, he would make it so that their marriage never existed. She thought for a moment as the prince's method was quite effective, but she knew that the magic tower was a closed territory, and there were also many hidden wizards there. She was puzzled since it was from there that her father delivered the medicines that her younger brother was treated with. She knew that they must most likely have a recipe and a method for preparing the medicines he needed. She knew that if she found out the recipe for the medicine, they would be freed from her father's tyranny forever. The Duke sighed heavily, and looking at the young lady said that she must say something. A moment later, the young lady said she would do it. They looked at her in surprise as they did not expect such a thing. She looked at the Duke intently and said that they should get married. The Duke in turn froze in shock. He did not expect to hear something like that from her. He looked at her worriedly and asked what kind of nonsense she was talking about. Selena looked at him intently and said that she was not crazy. She said that nothing was stopping them from doing this, and if one thing was remembered, it should have been done a long time ago. He looked at her excitedly and asked what she meant. She looked at him intently and said that he should enter the room so as not to shout in the corridor because they could be heard. She looked at him intently and said that they were in the palace now and they didn't need any extra fuss. The Duke looked with fury at all those present who were staring at them. He looked at her and said that they could talk. He asked what she was thinking about when she talked about marriage. She looked at him intently and said in all seriousness that they could get married. He was surprised and did not understand why she suddenly changed her mind. He shouted that she had forced the prince to remain silent about this topic. He asked if she felt ill after dinner or if it was a consequence of the ritual. She sighed heavily and said that it was not so. He asked if she was affected by what happened a year ago during the graduation ceremony. He said he thought she had forgotten about it all. She asked if he remembered that he himself had said that he would take responsibility. He said excitedly that she herself had told him that she did not need his responsibility. She looked at him hard and said, "That was it. She said that they could do it again." He looked at her with confusion and excitement, as he did not expect this. With lightning speed, she pulled herself closer to him and kissed him, saying passionately that this time he had to take responsibility. Millard was a little worried and wondered if his friends had been drinking hard liquor instead of water their whole lives. A moment later, he saw the bottle on the ground, and for a moment he wondered where it had come from. Selena sat in the gazebo and sang alcoholic drinks with a smile. She called him to her with a smile. She looked at him intently and asked him with a smile if he had enjoyed the banquet. He asked in surprise if she had really drunk it all herself. She smiled and asked if he meant that she had no friends to drink with. He said that she would end up very drunk. He suggested that she go back to the dorm. She sighed heavily and said that she didn't want to leave. Selena looked at him intently and asked if he wanted to sit with her for a while. He froze in embarrassment and surprise. He sighed heavily and said that she was too drunk and it was time for her to go to bed. She told him everything for a while. She sighed heavily and said that she had no family and no friends with whom she could communicate. He looked sadly at the young lady. She sighed heavily and said that it was time for her to go back and also asked if he would put all the bottles away. A moment later, she stood up as she was about to leave but suddenly slipped and almost fell. He caught her. She looked at him intently and asked shyly if he would like to have a drink with her in the room. She smiled and said that he was surprisingly not drinking well since his face was now very red. He smiled and said that she should not make fun of him. She smiled and said that she gave it to him, but he has weak points. He asked what she thought of him. The young lady looked away from him and said sheepishly that he was a well-liked boy of noble birth. The Duke sighed heavily and told her that she had something on her face. He slowly touched her beautiful face, and for a moment they froze, looking at each other. He was taken aback and removed his hand. A moment later, he sheepishly asked for forgiveness. The young lady in turn slowly approached him and kissed him tenderly. He froze in place from embarrassment. The young lady in turn slowly began to undress him. He looked at her intently. Selena in turn slowly undressed and looking into his eyes said that he should forget this day. She kissed him passionately. The next day, the young man woke up and froze for a moment because he did not see the lady next to him. With lightning speed, he rose up on the bed and called her. Her young lady shuddered when she heard her name. He looked at her in surprise and said that it was too early for him to ask where she was going. She sighed heavily and, without looking at him coldly, said that she was going home. He asked in surprise if she really wasn't going to the main ceremony. He said that if they started getting ready now, they would make it. She asked in surprise what he was talking about. He sighed heavily and timidly said that she herself said that she had nothing to do there because she had no family or friends. He said embarrassedly that since something had already happened between them, he was ready to take responsibility for everything. She said that they were very drunk yesterday and it was just a drunken accident. She looked at him and said that they were both victims in this situation. The young man froze in shock as he did not expect to hear something like this. She looked at him hard and said coldly that she didn't want any responsibility. He sighed heavily and said that he knew she was drunk yesterday, but not that drunk, and they both realized that she wanted it too. The young lady said it wasn't so. She said it could have been anyone. As she left, she said they could have pretended it never happened. Millard froze in shock. He was very surprised because he didn't expect to hear something like that. In his haste, he shouted to the young lady to wait as they had not finished their conversation. He looked at her intently and said that she herself said that they should forget about that day. She looked at him intently and said that he didn't have to do anything, just lie silently. He asked if she hadn't mentioned then that she could have been anyone in his place. She looked at him intently and asked if that day had really left some mark on his life. She looked at him intently and said that she wouldn't believe it until it happened. She sighed heavily and said that if he didn't want to, then they wouldn't do it. Selena looked at him intently and said that in that case she would just leave. Millard did not answer her, but a moment later, he grabbed her by the arm and with the speed of lightning threw her onto the bed. For a few minutes he stared at her, but later kissed her passionately. He slowly continued kissing her all over her body, knowing her lady. She trembled and asked him to wait a little. He looked at her in surprise and asked why he should stop since she herself wanted it. He looked at the young lady intently and said sheepishly that he would make sure she never forgot this day. Selena froze and did not answer. Sometime later, the young man looked intently at the young lady who was lying quietly in bed. He looked at her intently, lost in his thoughts. He quietly asked her if this time was better than the last one. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. She asked if he really thought she had it easy that time. The Duke in turn was taken aback because he thought she was asleep. Selena quickly rose and, sighing heavily, said that he was better soon. She said that on that day he calmly walked up to the podium and finished his prepared speech. She faded for a moment and said that she had been like a fool that day. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. He looked at her intently and said that he would ask her again. Millard looked at the young lady intently and said that she should look him straight in the eye and answer as honestly as possible. He looked at her excitedly and asked what that day meant to her. The young lady in turn looked away from him. She did not know what to answer. He was taken aback and looked at her intently as he saw that she was embarrassed. He looked at her confusedly and asked if it was true. He wanted to know if she was lying. She looked away from him puzzled and asked why he kept asking if he didn't believe her. She sighed heavily and said that she was tired and suggested that he take a little rest. The Duke looked at the young lady with embarrassment, but did not answer her. A moment later, he lay quietly on the bed. She glanced at him sideways. The young lady knew that, alas, the last time she had justified it by saying that they were both drunk, but this time everything had happened of their own free will, and they were sober. She was puzzled and wondered if it was good or bad. She knew that something very important had happened today, after which they were to get married. She knew that he was a very nice and sweet man, and he was the only one who had treated her well, even though she had been rude to him. The average of all the people who envied her for having the power of a goddess, he was the only one who sympathized and understood how heavy this burden was. She understood perfectly well that he was perfect for her in every aspect. Selena froze in embarrassment. She was puzzled and did not understand why she was remembering this. She knew she didn't need to think about such things. The young man, in turn, lay quietly in bed and thought about everything that had happened. Selena really appreciated the young man. He always helped her and was always there for her. And besides, he was her first sexual partner. She knew perfectly well that she always wanted to see him next to her. It seemed to her that she even dreamed of using their marriage to escape from her worthless family. She felt guilty, but she couldn't do anything about it. Selena knew perfectly well that if in the future he would blame her for selfishness, then she would endure everything. She knew that she needed to escape from her family, and to do this, she needed to enter the magic tower and find out the recipe for a medicine that he didn't even know existed. She knew that in that case, she would escape and be able to provide a happy life for her brother. The young lady sighed heavily as she felt very sorry. She didn't want to do this to him at all, but she had to take care of her brother. The prince looked at the young people with a beaming smile. He smiled and asked if they had already started dating. He did not know when this happened, but he saw that the changes were already visible, and he noticed that they were already getting along with each other. He smiled and said that it was very strange because they had been hiding their love for each other all this time. He looked at them with a smile and said that they were the best actors in their play. He looked at the Duke in surprise and asked how he had managed to hide something like this all this time. He sighed heavily and said that he was generally known for his insight. The Duke could not stand it and called the prince. He did not want to hear something like this addressed to him. He looked at them intently and said that since this decision had been made by them, he both wanted to know the reason why they had dared to do this. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she changed her mind when he mentioned the magic tower, as she had one thing she needed to do there. The prince asked in surprise what exactly she was interested in. The Duke looked at the young lady in surprise, as he had not heard anything like that from her. Selena sighed heavily and, plucking up her courage, said that she needed to steal something from there. The young people froze in shock. They did not expect to hear anything like this at all. The prince looked at the lady intently and in surprise and asked what she was talking about. She sighed heavily and told the prince that he had heard right and it was all true. She sighed heavily and said that the future duchess had declared her intention to become a criminal. He looked at them closely and said that they were pleased, which had surprised him for the second time. The prince looked at the duke and said that he would like to hear his story, since judging by his reaction he was also hearing the history of the universe for the first time. The prince asked why he decided to marry the young lady. He wanted to know if the duke was sure that he agreed to this. Millard thought for a moment. He remembered his conversation with Selena when she told him that they could do it again, but this time he had to take responsibility. In fact, he already understood everything as soon as he looked into her eyes and went along with her, not because he liked it and he desperately wanted something else. It was the moment when he first saw sincerity in her eyes and real desire. Togo himself, without realizing it, he felt an obligation to help her. He had to sleep with her to put the noose of responsibility on him, but in fact, before that, he was already ready to take responsibility. He looked closely at the prince and said that he was ready to take responsibility. The prince sighed heavily with a smile and said that he thought the duke would say that he looked at the young lady and asked what she wanted to steal. He said that if it was gold or treasure any kind, then he could help her since he had it in abundance. Millard looked at the prince and asked what he would offer him if he married the young lady. The prince thought for a moment. The prince looked at him with a smile and said that he thought his marriage itself and the opportunity to be one with the young lady was already a reward for him. He sighed heavily and told the prince that he was talking about something else. He wanted to know what benefit his family would receive from the marriage. He sighed heavily and looked intently at the young lady. Selenova in turn turned away from them and said that she did not need gold or jewelry. She told the duke not to even think about spending his hard-earned money on a fictitious marriage. She sighed heavily and said that he should not give her anything. The duke in turn looked at the young lady with bewilderment and surprise, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. The prince looked at the lady and asked what she needed in the magic tower. He said that the item could be found in their kingdom. The young lady sighed heavily and said that what she needed could only be found in the magic tower. The duke looked at her worriedly and said that in that case they could make a legal request. She sighed and said that if she could do that, she would have done it long ago, but unfortunately the thing she needed could not be obtained legally. For a moment the duke was angry as he understood that she wanted to marry him in order to steal something from the magic tower. He was a little offended to hear such things. The prince looked at the young lady with a puzzled expression and asked if she really thought he could let someone into the magic tower who had already declared her intention to steal something important. He sighed heavily and said that the task he wanted to entrust them with was quite dangerous. He said that this task would be very difficult for them to solve, but in her interests there is another impossible task. She is excited, said that she will definitely make sure that no one catches her, and she promises that she will not cause any trouble to anyone. She looked at the prince intently and said that she was asking him very much about this, since she really needed to get into the magic tower. The duke looked at the young lady intently and said nothing. A moment later, he looked at the prince and said that he would take responsibility and look after the young lady. Selena was taken aback as she did not expect to hear such a thing from him. He looked at the prince intently and said that he was ready to make every effort to fulfill his requests. The prince sighed heavily and told the duke that the final word was his, and he very much hoped that the duke was ready. A moment later, the prince sighed heavily and looked at them intently. He told the young men that if their lives were in danger, they should leave there immediately. The young lady thanked the prince. The duke said that they should now hear what work was being discussed. The prince looked at them intently and said that first they needed to get married, then go as part of an invitation, as a delegation to the magic tower, and find evidence of their guilt in what was happening in the kingdom. The young lady excitedly asked the prince what had happened so strange in the kingdom that he needed to find evidence in the magic tower. He sighed heavily, and looking at them said that a very unusual incident had occurred. The prince said that a man had recently died near a port city. There was nothing strange about the death itself. He sighed heavily and said, "That's no problem." He was thrilled that the next day he came back to life and walked normally. She looked at the prince excitedly and said that soon she was sure he had not died, or perhaps a miracle had just happened. The prince looked at them intently and said that he had thought so too at first, but in their times miracles did not happen often. The duke asked the prince excitedly if he really meant to say that similar incidents had happened in other places. The prince said that there had been more than 10 such cases where the dead had risen and had begun to wander. He said in a puzzled tone that their trait was strange, as they would attack other people and bite them, and they would eat meat, and the knights who fought them could not defeat them. He sighed heavily and said that after they woke up they were simply impossible to kill, and the knights said that even after the fireball and numerous sword strikes to the body, they moved as if nothing had happened. He said that they had to deal with the risen dead who bite other people. He looked at them intently and asked me if they thought that there were too many peculiarities in this incident to consider it as something natural. The duke thought for a moment and asked the prince if he really thought that the magic tower was involved in this incident. The duke said that there were no leads to them, judging by his story. He did not understand why the prince believed that they were involved in this situation. The prince looked at the young man closely and said that he had received another piece of information. He looked at them and said that you are experimenting on people in the magic tower. The young people were shocked by what they heard. The duke looked closely at the prince and asked what he was talking about. The prince said that several hundred years ago, a mad wizard experimented with chimeras on animals and humans. Eventually, it was condemned by the authorities across the continent, and a continental law was created, banning experiments on humans. He said that the magic tower took this law into account, and the wizards who were experimenting on people suddenly disappeared. He sighed heavily and said that wizards could do anything to discover new knowledge and magic, and he thought that a lot had happened, and they could go back to it again. The duke was a little puzzled. He knew that wizards were obsessed with everything new, but he could not believe everything that was happening. He knew that they must not fall for the tricks of magicians. He knew that she had lessons in the history of magic and aristocracy. It was said that wizards were subject to many prohibitions from the law. The prince looked at them closely and said that there were still those who succumbed to temptation, and that there had been many cases of fraud on the part of wizards in recent times. He sighed heavily and said that there were times when ordinary people gave them all their money. The duke looked at the prince closely and asked how reasonable it was to rely on the information he had received about conducting experiments on humans. He said that it was logical if he had secretly explored the magic tower based only on the information. He said that if they were caught, they would have every opportunity to counterattack him. The prince sighed heavily. The duke looked at the lady intently and asked her what she thought about it. She did not answer and sat quietly. He looked at her in bewilderment as he saw that her face had turned pale. He thought that most likely this incident had a strong impact on her and on her emotional state. A moment later, he wondered if it was possible that he had overdone it a little in bed, and that was why she was not in the mood. He knew that whatever the reason, they had better take a break. The duke looked at the prince and said that it was time for them to get ready for the wedding. They could come back to this topic next time. The prince looked at them with a smile and said that the wedding was a very important matter. The duke looked at the young lady and said that it was time for them to go. She slowly began to rise, but suddenly she felt dizzy and lost her footing. The duke looked at the young lady with concern. He managed to catch her before she fell. He looked at her intently and asked if she was okay. The young lady slowly pushed him away and walked forward. She looked at him sideways and said casually that he was okay with her. She was just a little lost in her thoughts. Millard looked closely at the young lady. He was alarmed by her condition. The prince looked at his friend with a smile and said that it seemed to be very difficult for him, and he should take care of himself. The duke agreed with him. The young lady said it was time for her to go home. Millard asked if she wanted him to take her in his carriage. He was very interested in whether her attitude towards him would change when they were married. Last time, she was very unhappy that he gave her a ride. He looked at her intently and said that they could rest a little in the palace. He looked at her intently and said that it would turn out that she had not yet fully recovered from everything. Selena looked at him intently and sighed heavily and said that she was fine. Millard looked at her and said that she didn't need to be stubborn because she really needed to rest. She glanced sideways at his hand, which was on her shoulder, and with lightning speed she pushed him away. Selena looked at him sharply and said that just because they decided to get married, it didn't mean he could do whatever he wanted. She angrily said that she had to go home. A moment later, her expression changed, and with a puzzled expression, she said that she really needed it. He looked at her intently and agreed. A moment later, he said that they could go together, as he also had some business to attend to. The Duke slowly sorted through the documents. He said that the prince had given him the protocol of the incident that had happened. He told the young lady that she also needed to read it. He slowly handed her the first part of the material. A moment later, he glanced sideways at her as he handed her the documents, but she did not take them. A moment later, he called her again. The young lady was taken aback and asked what he said. She apologized to him because she had not heard. He looked at her with bewilderment and said that she was acting strange today. The young man looked at his companion with concern and asked if everything was really okay. A moment later, he reached out to her and gently stroked her face. She froze in surprise. She was shocked she didn't question whether he really wanted to kiss her in such an atmosphere. She pushed him away and said that even though they had decided to get married, they didn't have to do it all the time. He looked at the young lady in bewilderment, and suddenly there was a dead silence between them. He looked at her sadly and said that he just wanted to measure her body temperature. He looked at her softly and said that she didn't need to be nervous at all. A moment later, he pulled away from her and said that fortunately she did not have a temperature. But if she did get worse, she should tell him about it at once. She was silent for a moment, but a few minutes later asked why she should do this. He sighed heavily and said that they were getting married soon, and they needed to take care of each other. Selena said furiously that their marriage meant nothing. She said that they just had to play their assigned roles. He looked at her intently and said that if she didn't like their sham marriage, then she shouldn't have tempted him. He looked at her intently and said that she herself had said yesterday that this time he had to take responsibility. He said that since she had asked him so desperately, he would do it. And this time, she couldn't refuse. He looked at her intently and said that he was not going to ruin his family with a fictitious marriage, and he would fulfill his duties as a husband and make every effort to get a divorce, and she could only imitate him to the extent possible and try her best not to get a divorce before the appointed time. He looked at her intently and said that from now on she had to tell him if she got sick or anything happened. He smiled softly at her and said that he would take full responsibility. The young lady in turn looked at him intently. She was very surprised since she did not expect to hear anything like that at all. The Duke looked at the Lord intently. He smiled and said that he had not been to the Stuart mansion for a long time. He looked at them intently and said that a lot of time had passed since his last visit, but nothing had changed in the estate. The Duke looked at the young man with hostility. His eyes did not understand why he had come such a long way. The Duke looked at him with fury and said that he had not even warned him about his arrival. Millard said with a smile that he had some very important information to tell them, and so it would be better if he and his wife heard it together. He smiled and said that he was planning to marry Selena. They froze in shock as they had not expected to hear anything like that. The rest looked at the Duke and, asking for forgiveness, said that he had not heard at all what he had said. Millard looked at them intently and in a calm manner said that he was going to marry his daughter. The man was furious. He shouted at the Duke not to dare to do anything like that. He shouted that as the father of the young lady, he was against this marriage, since he did not at all want to become their relative. The Duke sighed heavily and said that in the near future his assistant would prepare and send all the documents concerning their marriage. He slowly stood up and said that this was all he wanted to tell them, and for this reason he was already leaving. They were shocked as they did not expect anything like this from him. The Duke looked after the young man with fury. The lady looked at her husband in surprise and asked why this Duke wanted to marry their Selena. She looked at her husband intently and asked if he was really going to marry her off to the Duke. The man pushed his wife away and shouted that this was just nonsense. He said with fury that he had found, nursed, and raised an illegitimate daughter from a commoner. He screamed that such a worthless half-breed simply could not become a real duchess. He screamed that the title of Duke originally belonged to them, but they still seized the title and deprived their family of business. He was furious because he understood that he simply could not become a relative of people who put spokes in their wheels everywhere. He shouted with fury that such a thing would never happen. The young man looked at the Duke with a puzzled expression and asked why he had chosen the young lady out of all the girls. He shouted that even if a knife were put to his throat, he would never agree to such a thing. He did not understand how the Duke could marry the heiress of a greedy and depraved family. The Duke did not answer. He closely watched everyone present. The young man looked at him with fury and asked if he knew what rumors were going around about the young lady they were shouting, that they simply could not allow the Stuarts to become their relatives. Millard looked at everyone present and said that his opinion would not change. A moment later, he said that the given marriage was blessed by His Highness. The young people were shocked. They understood that he must become the main link that would oppose the union between their families. The Duke said that the prince had said that if their two great families united, they would have a great impact on national interests. They knew that the royal family only turned a blind eye to their constant feud. The Duke sighed heavily and, looking at everyone present, said that they had had bad relations in the past, but he thought that the moment had come when they would finally end. The man looked at the Duke intently as he knew he could not be persuaded. He looked at him intently and asked what power they had as vassals. He looked at the Duke intently and said that if he wanted to get married, he could do so. The man said that they have their own conditions for this marriage. The young lady stared out the window and thought she knew everything that several days had passed since she told her father about her wedding. She was surprised because the house was very quiet. She wondered if he had really decided to give her consent. A moment later, she turned around because she heard a crash. She saw her father. He was burning with anger. With the speed of lightning, he ran up to her and slapped her in the face. With fury, the young lady froze in place from shock and surprise, as she did not expect such a thing at all. He asked her furiously what she was doing. He asked her furiously if she really thought that if she got permission from His Highness, she would just go and marry the Duke. She froze for a moment and looked at the documents. He screamed that she was his child and he would not allow this to happen. He shouted that there would simply be no marriage. He shouted that today he forbids her to leave his room. As he left, he shouted that if she dared to leave the room, her brother would stop receiving his medication. She froze in place and did not say anything to her father because she understood that she simply had no choice. The young man ran joyfully to his sister with a cheerful smile. She was waiting for him patiently. With the speed of lightning, he rushed into her arms and with a smile said that he missed her very much. She smiled and called her brother. The young lady in turn wondered if her father was pleased that she had behaved quietly all week. She simply could not believe that he had allowed her to meet her brother. She looked at him closely and asked him with a smile if he had chewed well. He smiled and said that he was fine. She smiled and said that she was fine too. Selena gently stroked his head and said that he had grown a lot since their last meeting. He lived alone in a separate building of the mansion, in a place where only the Duke and a few magicians could enter under close control. He smiled and said that Dad bought him a lot of delicious things. She was puzzled since food, clothes, walking time, even the number of visits to the toilet were controlled. Mofra and the mage said it was all because of the treatment, but she knew that Neville didn't exist for them. She understood perfectly well that this was just a way to keep her under control, and she understood it. This control, which they called treatment, also caused doubts in her. She sighed heavily as she understood that they were doing all this in order to raise her brother to be an obedient child. In addition to the fact that her brother was developmentally delayed, he had seizures. It was as if he became someone else and attacked people. The magician diagnosed Nevelia with split personality. He needed treatment to suppress the violent personality and reduce the seizures. She was puzzled because he had been treated for many years, but he still did not get better. She did not understand why this was so. He looked at the cute butterfly with a smile and told his sister to also look at this amazing sight. She looked at him intently with a smile on her face, and since she knew that he rarely went outside, she was surprised even by an ant. A moment later, his face changed, and with a smile he told his sister that he had caught a butterfly. The young lady looked at her brother in excitement and said that this was not right, because if he grabbed it, the butterfly would die. He looked at his sister in surprise and asked what it meant to die. He asked if it really hurt. She hesitated, not knowing what to answer. Selena understood that he needed to know about it now. She looked at her brother intently and said that to die meant to feel nothing. No joy, no sadness, absolutely nothing. Selena said that if someone died, they would no longer be able to taste anything and enjoy it. She said that now the butterfly will not be able to fly freely. She looked at him intently and said that this means death. Trembling, he looked at her and shouted that she will be able to fly again. He was in shock and with tears in his eyes, shouted that the magician will fix everything. She sighed heavily and looked at her brother and said that death could not be fixed. She reached out to her brother and said that they could bury the butterfly in the backyard. He pushed away his sister who was reaching for him and shouted that it was not so, and he saw everything. He shouted that the magician could fix it. The young lady froze in place from shock. She called out to her brother, but it was all in vain. A moment later, the young man ran towards his house. She screamed and called him, but he paid no attention to her. She was very excited because she knew that her brother had changed after the treatment because before he was a child who trusted her completely. She was excited and did not understand since when he began to trust the magician so much. She looked after him intently because she understood that she needed to save him from his family as soon as possible. She knew that she could not delay the wedding because she needed help. The prince in turn walked slowly towards his father. He was immersed in his thoughts. A moment later, he entered the room and told His Majesty that he had something to tell him. He looked at his son closely and said that he had received no reports to worry about. The prince looked at his father closely and said that there was actually something he had not yet told him. He sighed heavily and bowing said that first he wanted to find out for himself who was behind this. Leonardo said that these incidents have been happening more and more lately, and now it is difficult for him to solve this problem on his own. He looked at his father and asked for forgiveness, saying that he had been blinded by the desire to gain recognition. The king looked at his son intently and told him to stop. He did not understand how a member of the royal family could bow his head so easily. He looked at us intently and told him to tell us everything he had learned. The prince looked at his father in surprise and asked if he really knew everything. The king looked at his son closely and said that he should not underestimate the king of the country. The prince was a little surprised as his father had much more information than he thought. He was a little surprised that knowing everything he did nothing to correct the situation. The king asked his son if he had found a solution to the problem in this situation. A moment later, the prince said that he had decided to quickly arrange the marriage of the Stuart and Eckhart families. The king looked closely at his son and said that he had already signed the decree allowing the marriage. He did not understand what else he wanted from him. The prince sighed heavily and said that the king needed to convince Stuart because he was ignoring all of Lord Eckhart's letters, and it seemed that by postponing this marriage he was trying to prevent it altogether. The king looked at his son closely and asked what he would gain from actively participating in this marriage. He sighed heavily and said that it was also worth considering that the nobility would not be delighted. The king asked his son if he would take such a risk. The prince looked at his father closely and told him to look at the documents. Leonardo told his father that he brought him a letter from Lady Selena. He sighed heavily and told the king that if he did not help after seeing this letter, she would refuse the marriage. The king in turn began to slowly read the young lady's letter. A moment later he said that he needed to meet with the Margrave. Selena knew that Mafra, who had an inferiority complex towards Eckhart, finally gave permission for their marriage on the 10th day after receiving Millard's proposal. A moment later, the young lady cast aside all her thoughts, and as the maid called her, she thought she was right. Her father didn't have the courage to openly disobey the king's order. The maid excitedly asked the young lady where to hang the flowers. Selena said she could take them to the column. She knew her father simply had no choice. He looked at the young lady with fury and shouted that she could not even dream of a wedding dress and gifts. He shouted that she had made the decision about the wedding herself, so she should take care of everything else herself. She sighed heavily because she hadn't expected anything in the first place, so she didn't feel disappointed, but she didn't expect him to be so intractable. Selena knew that the Eckharts hadn't taken away his title. She knew that he was very good at shifting blame onto others. The maid looked at the young lady and said that she had a letter from the Duke. She smiled and said that she would take care of everything else, and she needed to go to her room quickly and write him an answer. The young lady thanked the maid with a smile. Sometime later, she was sitting in her room and writing him a reply. She thought about him for a moment, as he told her with a smile that she didn't need to worry about the wedding at all. He said that he would prepare everything himself, and she should only take care of herself. When her father said that he would not give a penny for the wedding, she was ready to accept any criticism, but he did not express the slightest dissatisfaction. The maid looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that although the wedding would be in the garden and had been prepared in a hurry, everything looked very beautiful. She looked intently at her mistress and said with a smile that she was the most beautiful bride she had ever seen. Selena, in turn, was a little embarrassed as she did not expect to hear something like this. Looking at the maid, she asked if she had seen her brother. The maid asked for forgiveness and said that unfortunately she had not seen him. Selena sighed heavily as she knew that her father would not invite her brother. Although she knew this, she still could not believe that the wedding would take place without her brother. The maid looked closely at her mistress and said that Lady Esther had arrived instead of him. Selena looked at the maid with excitement and anger and asked if her sister was not at the academy now. She knew that her sister usually did not come home only on vacation. The maid smiled and said that the young lady came to her wedding. The maid smiled and said that the young lady would like to see her before the ceremony. A moment later, they turned around as the young lady entered and called her sister. The young lady in turn quickly rushed to Selena and hugged her tightly. Selena was surprised as she did not expect such a thing from her sister. She looked at her intently and asked if there were no exams at the academy now. She told her sister that she was very busy, but did not understand why she came. She smiled and said that exams were not so important because her only sister was getting married, and that was more important than exams. She looked at Selena intently and said that she would be very sad if sister did not come to her wedding. Madame looked at the maid and said that they were already looking for her and she should hurry. The young lady looked at everyone present with a joyful smile on her face. A moment later, she looked at her sister with a smirk and asked if she was really marrying the Duke. She looked at her sister with fury and contempt and asked what she was doing behind her back. She asked with fury if she was planning something while the young lady wiped her hands dismissively. Selena, in turn, looked intently at her sister but did not answer. She approached her with a smirk and asked if Selena knew that she was just a servant's daughter and had dirty blood in her. Esther smirked and told Selena that, of course, she didn't know anything. Esther looked at her with a smirk and contempt and said that this marriage was a fake and it was called a crime. Esther told her sister to get married and live quietly like a mouse, and she should not disgrace their name. She looked at her sister with a grin and said that she would not have time to do anything because as soon as the Duke got to know her better, he would immediately demand a divorce. Selena sighed heavily. She knew that she had to endure this since it was just a meaningless provocation. She knew that her sister wanted to ruin their wedding by angering her. Esther looked at her intently and asked if her concern for her brother was just a deception. She looked at her sister intently and asked with a smirk what her brother would think when he found out that she was getting married and leaving him alone. Selena looked at her intently and asked her to stop such talk. She asked with a smirk if she didn't like to hear the truth. She smiled and asked her mother if she was not right. She said that the lady was abandoning her sick brother without a shadow of a doubt in order to become a duchess. She looked at her intently and said that she would live happily in the meantime while he followed his sister around like a little tail, not realizing that he would soon be abandoned. The young lady looked at her sister with fury. Esther looked at her closely and said that she was very scared. She asked her sister if she was really going to freeze her to death. She looked at her sister closely and said with a smirk that it looked like she wanted to repeat the old story. Selena froze in place. The young lady looked at her intently and said that when she was angry, she couldn't control her strength. She asked with a smirk if she was going to kill her own sister now. She looked at Selena intently and said with fury that she was simply a murderer. A moment later, she looked away and said that now her sister is also a fraud. She thought for a moment and said that she didn't know what to call her because both options were suitable. She looked at her with disdain and with a smirk said that Selena had better calm down a little. She looked at Selena intently and said that she could leave but her brother would stay here. She didn't know who would care about a monster devouring their family's property. She looked at the young lady intently and asked if that was true. Selena froze in place from what she heard. Esther looked at her sister with a smirk and asked who would care about a monster devouring their family's property. Selena pushed her sister away. She looked at her in surprise and asked what she was doing. She looked at her closely and asked if she was worried about the cost of her brother's treatment. She said she should be worried about the cost of her education or the cost of her luxurious lifestyle. The young lady looked at her sister with fury but did not answer. Madame looked at Selena with fury and asked what she was allowing herself to do. She shouted that the girl did not know her place and boldly spoke to her daughter in such a way. Selena looked at Madame coldly and angrily. She said nothing to her. A moment later, she sighed heavily and looking at Madame said that if they uttered one more word, her patience would snap. She looked at her sister intently and said that she didn't even think about where the money she spent came from. Selena asked her sister if she knew why their incompetent father's business was thriving. She looked at her intently and said that it was all thanks to her. Selena looked at her sister with anger and said that she was born with the power of a goddess. Esther looked at her angrily but did not answer. Selena slowly approached her sister and said that if she behaved well, then she would also try her best to work for the good of the family. Selena said with fury that it was she who earned money for her brother's medicine and for her luxurious clothes. She told her sister to leave before it got worse. Selena looked at her sister with fury and contempt and said that she did not invite her to the wedding. The lady looked at her daughter intently and said that it was time for them to leave. The young lady was furious. She screamed and spoke about her mother, that her sister had threatened her and she had simply gone mad. Madame looked at her daughter worriedly and told her to be careful with her words, as Selena was blessed and she was not at all like them. The madam looked at her daughter and said that Selena was like a snake ready to bite at any moment. The young lady furiously asked her mother if the Duke knew about her vicious nature. Madame sighed heavily and said that it seemed that he knew nothing, and for this reason he was marrying her. She did not know if there was a person in the world capable of adopting such a terrible character. The Duke looked after them with a glare, with a smile on their faces. He thought that only her father was bullying her, but it seemed that the whole family was bullying her. A moment later, he knocked on the young lady's door and said he would come in. She looked at him in surprise and asked why he had come. The young lady froze in place in surprise as she saw the luxurious bouquet. She looked closely at the young man as he presented her with a gift with a smile. She looked away from him and asked with an innocent smile why he had personally brought the bouquet. The young man looked at her with bewilderment as he expected a different reaction. She looked at him in surprise and with a soft smile asked if something had happened. He looked at her intently and told her to look at him. She asked in surprise why she should do that as she knew he was probably busy. He smiled and said it would only take a minute. A moment later, he himself approached her and looked intently into her eyes. Millard looked closely at the young lady's face and asked if she had been crying. Selena was taken aback, not knowing what to answer. A moment later, she gently pushed him away and said that she had something in her eye. She sighed heavily and asked if he had seen what had happened. He sighed heavily and said that he had not seen but had heard since he was outside. He looked at her closely and asked how long they had been doing this. She hesitated, but a moment later said that he should pretend he knew nothing. Millard froze in surprise. A moment later, he sighed heavily and said that today she was a duchess. He looked at her closely and asked if she understood what that meant. He said that to ignore her was to ignore the Duke's entire family. She sighed heavily and said that she was not yet a duchess because the wedding had not yet taken place, and for this reason he should not be angry. He sighed heavily and said that he apologized if it seemed to her that he was angry. He looked at her intently and said he was just trying to get the message across that she was being treated unfairly. Clenching her fists, she said it was the first time she said he could leave now. The Duke grabbed his bride by the hand and said that the conversation was not over yet. He looked at her intently and told her to tell the truth, since her lie was obvious. He said that if he could help her in any way, he would definitely do it. She sighed heavily and asked what he wanted to hear from her. She asked if he really needed to hear all this. She said that the ceremony was about to begin and they didn't have time to talk. She was furious and wondered if he wanted her to tell him all the horrible memories that were troubling her. She smirked and said she would tell him everything. For a moment she wondered where she should start. She smiled and asked if she should start with the time she was starved for days because she didn't listen. She smiled and asked if he wanted to hear about how she was locked in a room alone for dropping a dish. Or maybe she should start with the time she was forced to rewrite the entire book all night after she accidentally dropped it. She looked at the Duke intently and asked if he really wanted to hear how she was beaten half to death because she couldn't control her strength. The Duke froze in shock. He didn't expect to hear anything like that at all. She looked at him intently and asked with a smirk if he was happy now. When Millard acknowledged her as his rival, then and only then did she feel satisfied with her existence. For this reason, she did not want him to know about her past at all. She clearly imagined what kind Millard would do if he found out about her deplorable situation. He looked at her intently with sadness and longing in his eyes and sighed heavily, saying that he needed to apologize to her. She sighed heavily as she was well aware that this was exactly how it would turn out. She knew that he had done nothing wrong today. On the contrary, all this time he had done everything possible for her. She knew that it was she who should ask for forgiveness for deceiving him and marrying him, for shifting almost all the preparations onto him. But she knew now wasn't the time for that. She knew she needed to get her brother's medicine first and get him away from her family and then tell him everything and really apologize to him. She sighed heavily, and without looking into his eyes, said that she did not need his apology at all. He sighed heavily, and said that then he would take his apology back. Instead, he handed her his handkerchief. He looked at her intently and said that she could cry. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. He smiled a gentle smile and said that she didn't have to keep everything inside. He said that she could give free rein to her feelings and cry in front of him. He looked at her with a gentle smile and said that she was crying quite cutely. The young lady in turn froze in place from shock and surprise. He slowly walked closer to her and said that she should cry only in front of him and should not let others see her tears. He hugged the young lady tightly and said that no one but him should hurt her. Selena was in shock. She did not understand what he was doing. Selena told him to let her go. Millard looked at her closely and said that she could cry boldly. He smiled tenderly and said that she could cry in front of him and in his arms. She was puzzled as she knew that today was their wedding day and she had only received so far. For this reason, she thought that he could be allowed to do whatever he wanted today. She was puzzled because the more affectionate and kind he was with her, the more pitiful she felt. She just couldn't stand him being like that. Selena knew it would have been better if he had scolded her, demanded, hurried her, and they had both been angry. Then she would not have been so ashamed. She sighed heavily and, pushing him away, said that he didn't need to pity her at all. He looked at her in surprise and said that he didn't pity her at all and that she could think as she wanted. He looked at her intently and said that he didn't believe that the desire to protect her looked like pity. He knew that even if this was so, he did not see anything bad in it. He smiled and said that the time for her exit would soon come. Leaving, he said with a smile that he would certainly wait for her. He left, and the young lady was left alone in the room. She said nothing in response to him and only nervously squeezed his handkerchief in her hands. The young lady ran up to the Duke in a hurry and greeted him. He looked at her in surprise and greeted her a moment later. For a moment, he remembered the vile words she had spoken about his future wife. With lightning speed, he turned around and walked away. The young lady looked at him in surprise as she did not expect this. She followed him around for a while, smiling and complimenting him and telling him that she was very happy that he would be part of their big family. A moment later, he stopped and said that he didn't think she needed him to tell her about the old feud between their houses, since she knew everything herself. He looked at her intently and said that their families were old enemies. He looked at her intently and said that he didn't even think that would change because of his marriage to her sister. The young lady was taken aback and asked what he meant. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that they would not have friendly conversations and none were expected in the future. The young man looked at the Duke intently and said that it was time for him to go out. He was taken aback for a moment as he saw the state of the young lady. The Duke smiled and told his subordinate to not pay attention to the young lady, as it was time for them to leave. A moment later they announced that the groom was entering. He looked at everyone with a smile, and a moment later, more seriously, he walked to the altar. The man looked intently at his daughter and said that after the wedding, nothing would change. A few minutes later, they announced that the bride was coming out. He quietly asked his daughter what she thought the Duke would do for her. He looked at her intently and said that no matter how she kicked, she would still belong to their family. As she walked down the path, she heard the whispers of everyone present. They were excited and did not understand why the bride had such an expression on her face. They said that if a stranger, someone saw her, they would think that she was being sold. She understood that they all wanted their marriage to be unhappy. She quickly pushed her father away and went to the groom. She knew that if they all wanted their downfall, then she would play even better, because she was used to wearing a mask different from her true essence. She stood next to the groom with a joyful smile. Millard looked at her with the same smile. The priest looked at them intently and said with a smile that he blessed them and declared them husband and wife. She learned that all that was left for them to do was kiss and walk under the arch. She knew that everyone looked at their marriage with suspicion and felt that something was wrong. She knew that this was not even surprising, because marriage with an enemy house is a good reason for suspicion. She knew that there was no need for their guess. The Duke looked closely at his wife and said with a smile that from now on, they would play the role of a happy couple in love. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that for this reason he should kiss her. A moment later he kissed his wife with all his passion. For a moment she froze in surprise, but knew what she had to do. Madame looked at her husband closely and said that the wedding had gone quickly. Maufra was very angry. He sighed heavily and said that it was because there were not so many guests. He did not know how many people had actually blessed this marriage. The lady thought for a moment and asked her husband if they could just let her go to the lady. They understood perfectly well that they needed her strength. He sighed heavily and said that she would not escape them because he had made a blood contract with her, an agreement that in the event of a unilateral violation of the terms could even result in the loss of life. She is obliged to return home several times a month on the orders of her father, and conscientiously help with the experiments in exchange for her father allowing the marriage, and he will not stop treating her brother in her absence. Last night they had made a blood pact with these terms. He knew that as long as this pact existed, she would never be able to escape from him, and he was very glad of it. She looked at her husband in surprise and asked why they needed a honeymoon. She shouted at him to turn the carriage around immediately. He looked at her intently and said that since they were in a hurry to get married and their new house was not ready yet, she sighed heavily as she remembered that they had decided to build a new house. She said that they could drive up to his estate. He sighed heavily and said that he didn't want to do that since their guests hadn't left yet. He looked at his wife intently and said that they would have to endure their jokes and drink alcohol with them all night, and he did not like that at all. He said that she herself did not want to ask her father for a place to stay. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he did not want to see him again on their wedding day. She sighed heavily and said that the exam at the academy was not that difficult. He smiled and said that that exam was just terrible. She knew that after they had quarreled, they had not spoken so calmly. She was a little puzzled because the kinder he was to her, the more she felt the inferiority that was growing in her. She knew that he had loving parents and nobles who admired him, and he was also very handsome and in good health. She knew that he didn't have to take care of his younger siblings at all, and he didn't have any dirty secrets. She sighed heavily as she wanted to be a little more like him. He looked at her closely and with a gentle smile said that she had tried hard. She knew that she had done nothing at all since he had taken care of the dress, shoes, and all other expenses for the wedding. And only thanks to him today they were able to hold the wedding ceremony without any problems. She knew that it was all thanks to him. Selena looked at her husband closely and asked if she looked pathetic. She sighed heavily and told her husband that he was simply impossible. He looked at her intently and asked if she could restrain herself just for today, even with all her hatred for him. She sighed heavily and looking out the window asked her husband, who told him that she hated him. She sighed heavily and said that she hated herself, not him. He froze in surprise. He looked closely at his wife as he did not understand why she looked so guilty. He didn't understand what her fault was. He wondered what kind of life she had lived that she hated herself before he was irritated by the young lady's groundless hatred. He looked at her hard and told her to hate him more than she hated herself. He said she could blame him for her getting married and for everything that would happen in the future. He sighed heavily and looking at his wife said that she should not take all the responsibility upon herself and she should not apologize or feel sorry at all. She looked at him in surprise and asked if this was all because he was her husband. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that everything was correct and that it was the duty of every man, namely he must take upon himself all the care of his wife. He looked at her intently and said that even her self-hatred should be directed at him, and that would be better. She sat quietly and looked intently at her husband without uttering a word. Sometime later they arrived at the place where they were supposed to spend the night. The man ran out and greeted the Duke with a radiant smile. He said that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. The Duke looked at the man with a smile and asked how he was doing. The man smiled and said that thanks to the Duke driving away those scoundrels he was doing well. The Duke smiled and said that he was glad to hear that. The man in turn looked sideways at the young lady. Millard asked his friend if he would show them into the house, was taken aback, and said that of course he would show them. He looked closely at the young lady and asked the Duke who she was. The Duke slowly embraced the young lady and looked at his friend with a smile. He introduced her and said that she was his Duchess. The man looked at the Duchess with a happy smile and greeted her and introduced himself. She looked at him intently and said that it was a pleasure to meet him. He looked at her with a smile and said that her voice sounded like the sounds of an angelic harp. The young lady looked at the man in surprise and was very embarrassed by his compliments. The Duke looked at his wife in surprise, wondering if she always responded to compliments like this. The man looked at the young people with a smile and told them to follow him. A moment later he showed them where their room was. He said with a smile that he could see them off personally. The young lady froze for a moment in surprise. The Duke looked at his friend closely and said that he should not worry. A moment later he looked at his wife and said that it was time for them to go. She did not flinch. He looked at her in surprise and called out. Selena looked timidly at her husband and asked if they would really share a room. Sometime later the young lady sat quietly in their room. She was a little nervous and uncomfortable. Selena wondered if they really needed to share a room. She sighed heavily and pulled herself together. She told herself that she had sworn to be patient and to fulfill her duties as a duchess. She knew that she should not back down at all since this was one of her duties. She was puzzled and didn't understand why she was so nervous. She wondered sheepishly if her nightgown was too revealing. The maid looked at the young lady closely and said with a smile that this model was popular among newlyweds. Selena looked at her maid in surprise, but still thanked her with a satisfied smile. She sighed heavily and sheepishly told herself that she would take this as a test. A moment later, the young lady started as she saw her husband after taking a bath. He sighed heavily and said that he felt much better after the bath. A moment later, he froze in place as he saw his wife. She looked at him in surprise and asked what happened. He slowly sat down on the bed and said sideways that he had not seen her in a nightgown. She was taken aback and asked in surprise what was wrong with her nightgown. She looked at him intently and asked why he cared about her nightgown. He sighed heavily and sheepishly said that she was right. For a while they both looked in different directions, embarrassed. Sometime later they were already lying quietly in bed. She was worried and wondered if he had just gone to bed. She sighed heavily and turned away from him because she thought she would die of embarrassment, but she was very tired and often thought that he would not be able to sleep next to her. A moment later she looked at him intently and asked if he was asleep. The young man did not react to her words in any way. She looked at him closely and wondered if he was really asleep. She came closer to him and looked at him closely as he looked like a sleepy person. She sighed heavily and looked at him with a smile as she noticed that he had adopted all the best from his parents. Selena knew that his beauty was given to him by the late Duchess, and that he inherited the Duke's expressive eyes as well. People said he was bad at expressing his feelings, but she knew that wasn't true. The way he looked at her was disappointment and boredom, but also sympathy and compassion. She was flattered that she was the only one who could sway the Duke. She knew that if he was asleep, she could look at him closer. The young lady slowly reached out to her husband, but a moment later froze in place in surprise as he opened his eyes. With the speed of lightning, he grabbed her hand and threw her on the bed. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he was really awake. He looked at her with a gentle smile and asked if it was possible to fall asleep when she was looking at him so intently. She looked at him excitedly and asked why he hadn't answered her. Then Millard looked at her with a smile and said that he had just decided to see what she would do. A moment later, he kissed his wife with all his passion. She froze in surprise, but a moment later she responded to him. A few minutes after the passionate kiss, she pushed him away a little and said that they had to leave tomorrow. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that he knew it. A few minutes later, he began to kiss her all over her body with passion. The Duke in turn stopped and reached for the lamp. She was taken aback, and pushing him away, asked what he was doing. The Duke looked at his wife in bewilderment. He knew that on their last nights together she had demanded that he not turn on the light. He had still complied with her demands, but today everything would be different. He knew that she was now his wife, and he wanted to see her. The young lady was taken aback and asked him not to turn on the light. He looked at her tenderly and said that if she did not like the light, then he could close her eyes. The Duke slowly reached out to his wife and tenderly closed her eyes. She was taken aback and shouted that this was not at all the case. She in turn just wanted to close his eyes. She didn't want him to see her. The Duke was taken aback and stood frozen in place. She realized what he saw, her scars and bruises. He looked at her intently and asked who did this. She was shaking and it was unbearably painful for her, from the fact that he saw her in such a state. A moment later she said furiously that he could look at her. The young lady in turn understood perfectly well that this was very disgusting, and she found it funny that even with the power of a goddess, she was subjected to violence. He looked at the young lady intently, and a moment later he yanked her blanket away. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was doing. He didn't answer her, but she screamed at him not to touch her. He looked at the young lady and asked who said that should stop him. He sighed heavily and said that the night was just beginning. She looked at him in surprise and said that he had already seen everything. Trembling, she said that she had many scars. He looked at her in surprise and calmly asked what was wrong with the scars. She was taken aback. She didn't expect to hear something like that. A moment later, the young man tenderly kissed his wife's feet. Millard looked at her and said that she could not concentrate at all. She was taken aback and looked at her husband with embarrassment as she did not expect such a thing. He looked at her intently and asked with a smile how she had studied at the academy then. Millard smiled and said that if she couldn't concentrate, he would definitely help her. The young lady looked at him confusedly. She couldn't answer him. After a stormy night, the young lady slept quietly in bed. The young man slowly got dressed. He glanced sideways at his wife, who was sleeping quietly in bed. The man looked sadly at the Duke and said that it seemed he was leaving very early. He did not know when they would be able to see each other again. The Duke smiled and said that they would stop by again sometime. A moment later, the Duke handed the man a note and said that it contained the location of a gambling house where people were traded. The man was taken aback as he did not expect to hear such a thing. The Duke looked at him intently and told him to find out more about it. The young lady in turn stood quietly on the shore and gazed intently into the distance. She was a little surprised, but at the same time glad that this place was very quiet. She knew that if she looked back, her life had been constantly noisy. Sometime later, the Duke approached his wife and called out to her. He looked at her intently and asked what she was thinking about so hard. He looked at his wife with a soft smile and asked if she would like to take a little walk. She looked at him intently and agreed. She looked at her husband in surprise and asked why they had gone to this place on their honeymoon. Selena said that it was not a well-known tourist destination, and it was even quite cold here. He smiled and said that the prince recommended this place shortly before the wedding, and it was related to their work. The young lady sighed heavily as she understood everything. She understood that the honeymoon was just an excuse, and they were only in this place because of work. She looked at her husband closely and said that she understood everything, and also asked where they should begin their investigation. He asked surprised but smiling if she was disappointed. Selena looked at him in surprise and asked why she would be disappointed. He looked at her closely and said with a soft smile that he actually had many options, but he chose this place because it was his mother's homeland. The young lady was taken aback and looked at him closely because she didn't expect to hear something like that. She became silent for a moment, ashamed of the words she had said earlier. She looked at him intently and said timidly that it was very beautiful here, and also that there were few people and the air was clean. She smiled sweetly and said that here was the most beautiful sunset she had ever seen. The Duke looked at her with a soft smile. Selena would like to add a few more words about this place. A moment later, she looked at her husband in surprise as he extended his hand to her. He smiled tenderly and, looking at his wife, asked if she would like to look around a little first. Millard looked at his wife intently and said that after all, this was their honeymoon and they could forget about work for a while. The young lady in turn agreed with him. She slowly took his hand. Sometime later, they were sitting in a nondescript establishment. The young lady looked around the area and said that there was a completely different atmosphere in the port. He smiled and looked at her and said that it was because there were people here. He sighed heavily and said that he would not give up on life even if the port was closed. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that it was amazing. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. She was taken aback and asked if she had really said that out loud. He looked at her with a gentle smile and said that it was exactly like that. He asked what surprised her so much. She smiled and said that she was surprised by the very conversations people had because they were talking about family, about their boss, or about what would happen tomorrow. They were worried about how to get money for a drink. She smiled and said that this calmed her down. The Duke looked closely at his wife. He smiled and said that she also thinks about what she will have for breakfast, for example. She looked at her husband with a smile. She knew that what really worried her were those who had escaped death. She felt like her head was about to burst from thinking about how to get the potion from the magic tower. She wondered if she didn't have the power, would she be like them? She wondered if she would have worried about breakfast. Then she wondered if she would have gossiped. She wondered if she would have talked to her friends about men, too. It all seemed very ordinary and simple to her. She froze in place with embarrassment and wondered why she had imagined the Duke as her husband. She was puzzled and very confused. Selena wondered if she really had no imagination at all. The Duke looked at his wife in surprise and called her. She sighed heavily and said that they would not be able to live peacefully now if she did not exist. He smiled at his wife and said that she was protecting the borders with the power of the goddess and saving the country from disasters. He looked at her intently and said that she had to give up her ordinary life in order to protect their country. The young lady looked at her husband in surprise, as she did not expect to hear anything like that from him. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. She didn't have time to finish speaking when suddenly they heard a noise. The young people looked to the side in surprise. They noticed a man who entered the establishment. Everyone looked at the man in surprise as he was in a deplorable state. The man in turn was very excited and shouted to everyone that the monsters had appeared again. The young lady sat up in surprise and looked closely at the man. She was excited. A moment later, she turned her gaze to her husband. She wondered if this was the monsters the prince had told her about earlier. The Duke looked closely at the people who were walking around the city. He sighed heavily and said that this was similar to what the prince had spoken about. He was puzzled. The Duke said that they looked much worse than he imagined, and they could not even be called human. He looked at them intently and said that the prince had warned them earlier that the disease was transmitted through a bite. He looked worriedly at his wife and asked if anyone among those who had run into the pub had been bitten. She looked worriedly at him and said that she did not know this, since she had not had time to look at them. She was a bit agitated and said there was a commotion in the pub, and she ran out straight away. Suddenly, memories came flooding back to her, and she remembered the words of the prince. He told her that if they met anyone on their way, they should not hesitate, but should immediately kill such monsters. The Duke thought for a moment. He remembered the prince's words, but he wondered if they could be cured if they were sick. A moment later, his thoughts disappeared as he heard his wife's voice. She looked at him excitedly and shouted that he should be careful. A moment later, a monster in the form of a man was already rushing towards him. With lightning speed, the Duke dodged the monster's attacks, and with ease struck him. The monster growled. The Duke sighed heavily and, looking at the monster, said that it looked like it would be difficult. He looked at his wife and shouted that the prince had ordered them to kill them on sight. He froze in place in excitement when he saw that she was rushing towards her husband, a monster. He was very surprised because he saw that she simply froze in place. The Duke shouted and called his wife, but she looked at the monster as if spellbound. The young lady froze in place. She was unable to do anything. The Duke screamed and called his wife. With lightning speed, he dealt with the monster and quickly ran to his wife. He looked at her excitedly and called out. He was very scared and asked her if she was okay, but the young lady was very lost. She could not answer anything. A moment later, he heard a noise in the distance and turned around. He was puzzled because he saw that the monsters were getting up again. He didn't understand how they could kill them. The lady, trembling with fear, said that these monsters must be attacked in the head. The Duke looked at his wife in surprise and asked what she was talking about. At the same time, the monsters quietly approached the Duke. The Duke looked at his wife in surprise and asked how she knew about this. The young lady cried out in alarm and called her husband. He looked at her in surprise because he did not understand why she was screaming like that. At the same time, the monster approached the Duke. With lightning speed, the young lady attacked the monster. The Duke stood frozen in shock for a moment as he watched everything that was happening. He froze for a moment, looking at the monster as he realized that his wife's words were true. He saw that as soon as she attacked his head, he stopped moving. The young lady looked at her husband with fury and asked how he could turn his back on the monster to save her. Selena screamed that he should not do such a thing again. The Duke looked at his wife intently. He sighed heavily and, taking her hand, said that he could not promise this and she should not be angry. He looked at her intently and said that they didn't have time for this now. He sighed heavily and, looking at the monsters, said that they needed to deal with them first. Millard sighed heavily and, looking at the monsters, said that it was a complete nightmare. They stank of rot. He wanted to get out of this place as soon as possible, but he knew that they needed to conduct an investigation. He looked closely at his wife and asked what they would do next. He said that they could continue their investigation or go back. The young lady looked into the distance, worried, and said that he should wait a little. She looked closely at her husband and said that in the Tomback pub, the man who ran inside and called everyone for help was covered in blood and seemed to have been bitten. He looked closely at his wife and sighed heavily and said, "They seem to have started an investigation." He said anxiously that they need to hurry. The young man looked at the Duke intently and said that their knights had collected all the bodies that were on the streets and in the pub. The Duke sighed heavily and thanked the young man for his work. He looked closely at the assistant and asked how many bodies they had collected. He slowly glanced at the documents and said, puzzled, that a total of 49 bodies had been collected. The Duke was puzzled as he knew that if they had carefully checked those who entered, they could have prevented everything. He sighed heavily because he knew that they had been lulled into a false sense of security, and he had not thought that everything would start immediately upon arrival. In the end, in a small village with a population of less than 349 died. He knew that this was without a doubt his fault. The man looked at the Duke intently and said that they needed to be burned as soon as possible, as there was a risk of the epidemic spreading. The Duke was puzzled as he knew that those people who did not know the details might think it was the plague. He looked at the assistant closely and said that they needed to know who they were. The young man said that he had already instructed the village elders to look into the matter. The Duke looked closely at the young man and said that he was, as always, an indispensable assistant. The Duke thanked the young man again for his hard work, and a moment later he said that he would finish the job himself. The young lady, in turn, slept quietly in the room after everything that had happened. The Duke entered the room and looked intently at his wife. He did not understand why she froze when she saw the monster. He was a little worried because he didn't understand why she looked into his eyes for so long as if she was communicating with him. The Duke was surprised and didn't understand how she knew that the monster's vulnerable spot was the head. The Duke realized that the monster that approached his wife moved differently than the one that attacked him. To Millard, it seemed as if the monster simply did not want to attack. He looked closely at his wife as he could tell that she knew something about the ferocious monsters. He was puzzled and wondered what she was hiding. Millard looked at the young lady with an anxious look and asked if she really knew about everything. The young lady, in turn, woke up in horror from a terrible nightmare. She was agitated and anxiously called her husband. A moment later, she turned around and noticed that he was sleeping quietly next to her. She sighed heavily as she was glad that he was okay. She knew it was no simple epidemic, the smell that came from them and their reactions as if they were dead. She didn't know how it all started. She was worried because she didn't know who could be involved in this whole story. The servants looked at the young men and greeted them. The Duke looked at them and thanked them for their work. He looked at everyone present and said that it was too late and they could postpone the acquaintance until tomorrow. The young man looked at the Duke and said that although they had returned late, they would still have to postpone their rest for a while since a guest had arrived. The Duke was surprised since he was not expecting guests at such a late hour. The prince looked closely at the young people and said with a smile that they must have brought many interesting stories from their honeymoon. They looked at the prince in surprise. He looked at them intently and said that they should not make his expectations in vain. Sometime later, they were sitting in the living room and talking. He smiled and said that the young people's house was very beautiful. He looked at the young lady intently and asked her how she liked the new house. He smiled and said that the Duke had worked very hard on it. She looked at him intently and said that he could not have come without something to do at such a late hour. The prince looked at the young lady with a smile on his face, for he expected nothing else from her. He smiled and said that he was sure that after the Duke, she was the second one who knew him best. He sighed heavily and said that it was finally time to go to the magic tower. The Duke looked at them intently and said that before they read the materials, he would like to say something. He looked at the young lady and said that during their investigation he had learned the following. She slowly began to read the documents. He sighed heavily and said excitedly that those who escaped death appeared suddenly, and they did not die no matter how many he wounded. He glanced sideways at his wife and said that they had a vulnerability. He looked closely at his wife and said that their weak spot is the head, and they have already taken measures, and they are also carefully monitoring that information does not leak out. The prince sighed heavily and looking at the Duke said that he had no idea how he had done it. He said that he had actually thought that he would come and hear about something interesting, namely what had happened during their honeymoon, but it turned out that many terrible things had happened. He looked at his friends closely and said that they needed to deal with this quickly. He was a little worried as he knew that this disease was spreading quickly, and if it continued like this, the entire empire would soon be infected. Selena looked at the prince intently and asked if this was all the materials they had on the case. He sighed heavily and said that it was true. She thought for a moment as if the magic tower was connected to monsters, they would hide this information. She said that these materials were completely useless. She looked at the prince intently and said that the internal diagram was also meaningless because it deformed their appearance and changed their shape, sighed heavily and said that it was not enough. A moment later, a servant came to them and said that she had just received a letter from her father. He looked hard at the Duchess and said that he had been told that it was very urgent. The prince looked at the young lady and said that her father knew how to surprise. He was surprised and did not understand how he could have chosen the right moment and sent the letter on the very day they returned from their honeymoon. The young men were taken aback and looked at the young lady in surprise as she accidentally broke the cup. They looked at her intently and asked excitedly if she was all right. The young lady in turn trembled. With lightning speed, she stood up and leaving said that she would ask someone to clean up. The Duke looked at his wife with excitement and asked her to wait. The prince sighed heavily and said that all he had to do was just ring the bell. He looked at the Duke in surprise and asked if he had done something wrong. The Duke looked at the prince intently but said nothing. The young lady in turn slowly opened the door and looked closely to make sure no one was coming. She knew that everyone was already asleep and she just needed to quietly walk to her room. The Duke looked at the young lady intently and said that it was too late. She started as she had not expected to hear his voice. He looked at her intently and said that she had suddenly returned to her family and had only returned the following night. She looked at him excitedly as she was a little scared. A moment later, the young lady asked her husband for forgiveness. He looked at her intently as he saw that she was very worried. She looked puzzled and said that she knew that as a housewife she had a lot to do. She looked away from her husband and said that it would be better if they talked about it tomorrow. A moment later, she screamed as he suddenly picked her up in his arms. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was doing and also asked him to put her down immediately. He looked at her intently and told her that she should be quiet if she didn't want to wake everyone up. The young lady in turn looked at her husband with embarrassment but did not answer. Some time later, she was sleeping quietly in bed. She slowly opened her eyes to see if her husband was nearby. A moment later, she was taken aback as she saw her husband standing next to the bed and staring at her. She sighed heavily and said that they would talk about everything tomorrow. He sighed heavily and said that he knew what he said that he wouldn't ask, but he didn't say that he would pretend that he didn't know anything. He looked closely at his wife and said that it seemed like she wasn't going to tell him anything. He said that in that case he would find out everything himself. He looked at his wife with irritation and said that she could hide it as best she could. As he left, he said that he didn't care at all what it would be, but he wouldn't sit idly by if he found out. The young lady in turn sat quietly and stared at her husband. She wondered if he had found out anything. She was puzzled because she knew that this simply could not be. She was excited and thought that perhaps she should tell him where she was going and when she would return, but she didn't know what to say. She understood perfectly well that because of the blood pact she had to go where she didn't want to go at all. She was furious with herself because she knew there was no way she could tell him that. The maid looked at the gentleman with excitement and said that it was not even surprising that the servants simply could not keep up with them. The young man was in shock. He did not understand how much time had passed since their wedding, and they were already leaving the house. Millard looked at his assistant and with a soft smile said that he was staying here so he could rest easy. The Duke also thanked his assistant in advance for his work. The young man was shocked. He did not understand how he could cope with such a huge mansion. The maid looked at the young lady with concern and with tears in her eyes said that her health was not very good. She wondered if they really had to go so far. She shouted that it was a magic tower and it was very far away. The Duchess smiled and said that she would be all right. The Duke looked closely at his subordinates and said that if anything urgent came up, they should inform the prince about it. He looked closely at the young people and said that the prince would definitely help them. The Duke looked at the coachman and said that they needed to stop at the palace first. The young people looked at the prince intently. They were surprised and did not understand what he was doing there. He looked at them with a smile and said that finally he waited for them and they came. The prince looked at the young man and said that he was in a great hurry and also told his friends that this was the man who would take them to the magic tower. The young wizard greeted them timidly. The Duke looked at the young man with surprise and calmness and said that there was still an eternity before the appointed time. The young wizard timidly said that the master of the magic tower had moved the time. He said in a frightened voice that time flowed differently in the magic tower, and in order not to be late for the event, they needed to hurry. The Duke froze in surprise for a moment when he heard about the owner of the magic tower they had not yet met, but he was already disappointed. He was already very worried about their week-long stay in the magic tower. He looked closely at his wife and asked if she was ready. The prince looked at the wizard with a smile and said that before they left, they needed to talk. He asked the wizard if he could move away a little. The wizard timidly said that he could not object to them and they could talk as much as they wanted. He, trembling with fear, said that time was running out for them. The prince smiled and said that it was a simple greeting and he did not need to worry. The prince looked at the young men intently and said that they should greet each other. A moment later, he said that he had placed some tools in the suitcase and he asked to get them from a magician who works in the shadows, and they should not be traced. The young lady looked at the prince with excitement and asked if he was talking to people who were too dangerous. The Duke looked at the prince closely and said that he did not have to do that at all. The prince sighed heavily and said that he trusted them, but if his doubts were true, then the magic tower was a place beyond imagination. He looked at the Duke intently and said with an innocent smile that foresight was the key to success. The prince looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that they needed a little time, as men needed to have their own secrets. She looked at them in surprise and asked if they were playing friends again. She said that it was hard for her to watch, so she would go. The prince's face changed, and looking at the Duke, he called him. The prince looked closely at his friend and told him to look after his wife and, most importantly, more carefully. The Duke looked at the prince in surprise and asked why he should look after his wife. The prince told his friend that he had not told him what had happened on their honeymoon. The prince looked at him and said that he did not think that the Duke had hidden it on purpose, but rather that he had simply not told him. He looked at the Duke intently and said with fury in his voice that they must tell him everything that happened in the magic tower. He said that they must not hide anything from him. A moment later, the wizard, trembling, cast his magic. He looked at them intently and told them to hurry and enter the portal. A moment later, the young people slowly entered the portal. Sometime later, they were already in the magic tower. The young lady was surprised because the wolf saw the magic tower. The Duke looked at his wife and called her. He said that Madame Frome was standing nearby, and the prince advised him to pay close attention to her, and the man standing opposite her was Admiral Dictrick. The Duke looked closely at everyone present and said that everyone was already here. A moment later, they were greeted. The young lady jumped when she heard someone's voice. The young lady looked at the young men and greeted them with a smile as they entered the magic tower. She smiled and said that her name was Lilac. She looked closely at the young people and said with a smile that she would take care of them while they were in the magic tower. The young lady was taken aback for a moment, as she had not heard the sound of footsteps and could not even imagine that someone would approach them so silently. The lady handed them a small bell. She said that if they needed anything, they could ring it at any time. The Duke in turn stood next to his wife, blocking her with his body. He was in no hurry, but he took the bell and thanked the young lady and also said that he was interested in knowing the schedule. She smiled and said that she would be happy to answer all their questions. She said that in the near future they would have the opportunity to attend a banquet organized by the Lord of the Tower. Lilac looked at them all with a smile and said that first they would have to wait a little in the hall, and when the banquet began they could go to the banquet hall. She smiled and said that after the banquet they would also be escorted to their quarters. She said that if they wanted to go back, they could just ring the bell and she would personally escort them. Then the next day, there was a planned tour of the magic tower. Selena looked at her closely and asked if this meant that after the banquet was over, they would have free time until tomorrow. She smiled and said that everything was correct, and the lady said that she was very smart. She looked at the sorceress in surprise and asked if this was really the answer about the schedule. The sorceress said that the information that a person can remember is limited, unimportant information is not remembered, and what was said earlier they can easily remember for today. She looked at the Duchess intently and said that she would tell them about their further schedule a little later in the afternoon. Selena looked at the young sorceress in surprise, as she had just been told that she was very smart. The Duke looked at her and said that he would like to hear everything at once. The sorceress asked the Duke for forgiveness and said that she could not do this since this was the principle of their magic tower, and besides there were certain rules that they must follow while they were here. They were not allowed to roam freely around the tower. She looked at the young people closely and said that they might be interested in the various magical places in the magic tower, but even wizards did not know all the spaces that were there. She said that if they got lost, they might never find their way back. Selena was taken aback as she did not expect this. The Duke stood between them again and looked intently at the sorceress. He said that he understood everything. Millard looked at Lilac and said that if she had nothing more to say to him, she could bring them a drink. Millard said they were in such a hurry that they didn't even get a cup of tea. Lilac sighed heavily and said that she would do everything now and they needed to wait a little. Sometime later they sat waiting for the sorceress. The Duke looked at his wife closely and said that he understood perfectly well that she was very nervous about Togo, that everything here was suspicious, but he asked, how about Togo changing his expression a little? She looked at him in surprise, there asking what he was talking about. He said that they had just gotten married, and they had to pretend to be a happy couple in love who had been invited to a magic tower, and so he felt that they should at least pretend a little. The young lady in turn glanced sideways at the sorceress, who slowly walked towards them with drinks. She sighed heavily and said that she would do everything now. The Duke looked closely at his wife and asked if she was out of the way. He asked if she could be at the banquet. The sorceress was taken aback and looked closely at them. The young lady said that as a guest invited to the magic tower, she could not simply not go to the banquet. He looked closely at his wife and said that if she asked the sorceress nicely, she would be taken to the room. She told her husband that she would wait and therefore she would not embarrass the sorceress. The young sorceress was a little puzzled as they were beaming with love. Selena looked at her husband closely because she understood that he was a very bad actor. She looked at him lovingly and called out. He mentally said that it didn't make any difference now, but in turn he looked at his wife with embarrassment and called her. The young lady slowly approached the young men and, asking for forgiveness for interfering, said that she had accidentally overheard their conversation. She said that before the banquet began they should greet the Lord of the Tower and rest. She asked if they did not mind. She smiled and said that she would explain everything to them now. Selena looked at her husband with a radiant smile since she wanted to leave the banquet for a while, and she succeeded. Sometime later, the newlyweds closely followed the sorceress. Selena had been counting the steps since they left the living room, as she knew perfectly well that it would be easier to find the office of the head of the magic tower, but she knew that they would hardly reveal the location of his office so easily. A moment later, the young sorceress said that they had already arrived at the place and she would wait for them outside. She slowly opened the door and they were blinded by the radiance. The young man looked at them intently and greeted them with a smile. She looked at him in surprise and wondered if this man was the head of the magic tower. She was surprised because he looked like he was the same age as them. The young man slowly reached out to the young duchess and introduced himself. He said that he was the assistant to the head of the magic tower. She looked at him in surprise as she understood that he was not the head. The duke in turn shook the young man's hand. He looked at him menacingly. Philahik looked at the young men with a smile and said that they sincerely welcomed the two of them. The duke looked at the young man and said that his wife was very tired, so they would like to meet the owner of the tower as soon as possible, and rest if possible. The wizard smiled and said that they should not worry about it as he was now taking them there. A moment later, he used his magic and a bright light illuminated them. A few minutes later, they found themselves in another room. The young people looked around in surprise. He smiled and said that now in front of them was the owner of the magic tower himself. The man smiled and said that he was very pleased to meet them, and he also introduced himself. He slowly used his magic and said that they should come closer. The young people were taken aback in a way they did not expect. The duke looked at the man with concern and said that they wished they hadn't used magic on them. The man looked at them with a smile and asked if they were asking the magician not to use magic. He said that it was the same as asking an investigator not to hand over his weapon. The duke said that in a peaceful environment, an investigator has no right to use a weapon. The man smiled and said that after his words he had nothing to say. He looked at them intently and said that magic was like breathing to him. He looked at the young lady and said that if they felt uncomfortable, then he would not use magic. The young lady looked at him intently and said that she felt uncomfortable. The wizard looked at the young lady intently and said that in that case he would restrain himself. He looked at them intently and asked if they didn't want to go to the banquet. He smiled and said that the banquet would be very fun, and he also asked if it would be okay for him to show up there for just a moment. She looked at the wizard and said that his assistant said that after meeting with the head of the magic tower, they would be able to rest. He looked at them and said that of course if a guest wants to rest, he should be given such an opportunity. He sighed heavily and said that they had put their whole soul into this banquet, so it would be a shame if they missed it. He looked at the young lady intently and said that it would be a very good experience. She looked at the man in surprise and wondered if something would happen in the banquet hall. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that if she still wanted to rest, then they could do so. He said that if they were still interested in something in the banquet hall, then they could call Lilac for help. He looked at the young lady with a gentle smile and said that he very much hoped that they would only have good memories of the tower. She looked at him in surprise and wondered if that was all. She thought they might be able to learn about the state of affairs in the kingdom or get clues about those who had escaped death. She sighed heavily and wondered why they had been called to the tower if they just wanted to see their faces and know their names. She was excited and didn't understand why they needed to call them to this room. The man looked at his assistant and told him to take the young people home. He smiled and said that he would do everything. The young sorceress looked closely at the young people and said that they quickly left. She looked closely at the young men because she knew that the owner of the tower had specifically asked to bring them, but she thought that the conversation would be longer. She said that she would take them to their room. Selena looked closely at this room as the young sorceress praised her very much. She noticed that the room was actually quite nice. The duke looked at his wife and called her. He looked at her intently and said in all seriousness that they needed to talk. The young man thought for a moment as he realized that the young lady was much more valuable than he had imagined. He saw that her radiant beauty was so alluring to him, and he really wanted to smash her to pieces. But he knew he simply wouldn't do it because she had an interesting power. The young man looked at the man and said that it seemed he still couldn't get rid of his attachment to the chair. The man, trembling, said that this couldn't be. Philachus looked at the man with a grin and asked if he hadn't told him that he should be more careful in his thoughts around him. He said that either he completely obeyed or carefully. The man, trembled with fear, said that he would not dare to have disrespectful thoughts. He looked at the man intently and said that they could come to an agreement. He said with a grin that he had a new task for him. He said that he needed to see the young lady alone. He asked the man if he could prepare a meeting place for them. He said that he did not have much time and he wanted to get closer to her within a week. The man, trembled with fear, agreed with the wizard and said that he would begin immediately, and he called the young man the head of the magic tower. The Duke looked closely at his wife and said that they needed to talk urgently. He looked at her intently and said that she must promise him that she would not wander alone in the magic tower. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. She asked her husband, irritated, why he didn't tie her up then. He asked if she really liked it. He said that if she didn't mind, he would tie her up just in case before leaving. She was taken aback and irritably shouted that she wasn't really asking him to tie her up. He sighed heavily and said that he wasn't joking with her. He asked why she couldn't just say that she wouldn't go alone. She sighed heavily and told her husband that she had already told him earlier that she had business here. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she had someone who would help her with the theft. She sighed heavily and told her husband that he also had his own job and they could not be together all the time. Millard looked at her intently and said that when she had the opportunity, she should call him. Selena was excited, looked at him and said that she was not a sorceress at all and could not call him if he was far away. The Duke sighed heavily and, looking away from his wife, said that then she could just wait for him. She was furious because she understood that he was simply stubborn. The Duke looked at his wife intently and said that he was very worried about her. She looked at him in surprise and confusion and asked what he meant. He sighed heavily and, looking at his wife, said that this was an unusual place. He said that she was a duchess and he was obliged to protect her as her husband. He said that she herself promised him to fulfill her duties as a duchess. He said that it didn't mean that she shouldn't go alone. It meant that she shouldn't make him worry. He looked at her intently and said that he really hoped that she would keep her word. She was at a loss because she didn't know what to do in this situation. The lady in turn did not want to involve her husband in this matter at all. She sighed heavily, for she knew that she herself had promised to do her duty. She sighed heavily and said that she would try to tell him about her plans if possible, and if necessary, she would offer to go with him. She looked at her husband intently and said that if he was not there at a really important moment, then there was nothing she could do about it. He looked at her with a soft smile and said that there was nothing she could do about it, and all he could do was be there for her all the time. Millard looked closely at his wife and, reaching out to her, said that it seemed to him that a little earlier she had been hotter than usual. She looked at her husband in surprise and asked embarrassedly what he was doing. He touched her forehead tenderly and said that she seemed to have a fever. He said that they should ask for medicine. She was a little worried because after arriving at the magic tower, she really wasn't feeling very well. She was surprised and didn't understand how he found out about this in such a short time. The Duke looked at the young sorceress in surprise and asked if they really didn't have any medicine. She sighed heavily and said that magicians don't trust medicines made by pharmacists because they can create more effective medicines themselves. She looked at the Duke intently and said that if he described the symptoms, she would call the healer of the magic tower. He thought for a moment, for the more he learned about wizards, the less he liked them. Selena looked at her husband closely and said that she was fine and did not need any medicine at all. He looked at her worriedly, as it seemed to him that her voice was hoarse. He understood that it was obvious that she needed a healer. He looked closely at the sorceress and asked if it was possible to meet with the healer of the magic tower right away. She smiled and said that she would clarify this point, since they were more important than guests and most likely it was possible. He looked at the sorceress intently and said that she should do it quickly. The young lady looked at them intently but did not answer. A moment later, she looked at her husband and said she was fine. He looked at her worriedly and said her face was red. He reached out to his wife and said that he would at least bring her some wet towels. She casually pushed him away and said that there was no need to do that at all, but a moment later she suddenly felt dizzy. A moment later, her legs gave way and she fell. With lightning speed, the Duke caught his wife. He cried out and called her, but it was all in vain. The young man looked at them intently and said with a smile that he had come just in time. The duchy looked at the young lady with anger and asked why he could not enter. The sorceress smiled and timidly said that she was very sorry, but the duchess's condition was extremely serious, and she needed complete rest. He asked angrily if the sorceress was sure that his wife was inside. She smiled and said that of course she was sure, and that was why the sorcerer had come as a healer. He did not even stop to eat or take a break from his treatment. She hoped that the Duke would return to his room and wait there. She sighed heavily as she had previously been very happy that she had been entrusted with taking care of such a beautiful and sweet couple, but now she was extremely puzzled as she did not think that it would be so difficult. The Duke said with fury that he needed to personally make sure with his own eyes that everything was fine with his wife. She screamed that this could not be done and told him that the door could not be opened from the outside, only from the inside. He looked at her with fury and said that she was this. They would still see. A moment later, he used his magic. The young sorceress was shocked by what she saw because she understood that he was using the power of the goddess. She heard that the power of the goddess and magic are incompatible. She screamed for him to remove it immediately. The Duke shouted furiously that he would not leave until he saw his wife. The young man looked intently at the young lady who was sleeping quietly. He knew that every time his expectations were exceeded, he did not think at all that they would meet so soon. He looked at the young lady with a sly smile, as he knew that his wizard had not even had time to do anything yet. He heard that she was born one of the strongest among all the wielders of the goddess's power. He thought that this was most likely the reason why she was so sensitive to magic. The man looked at the head of the tower and asked if he needed to wake the young lady. He smiled and said that there was no need. He looked at him in surprise and asked if he didn't want to see her. He looked at the wizard intently and said that he wanted to see the young ice girl. At all, he didn't want to talk to her. He knew that the look with which she looked at the wizard was very sharp. He didn't know what would happen if those enchanting eyes looked at him with the same look. He looked at the young lady with a smirk, as he already wanted to destroy them. The man looked at the head of the tower in surprise and asked what he said. He smiled and said that he had not called him at all, and that he should continue his work. A moment later, the wizard used his blood magic on the young lady. The tower leader slowly reached out to take the young lady's hand. But suddenly they were taken aback as they heard some noise. The man excitedly shouted to his master that it was very dangerous, and he would immediately find out who attacked them. The head of the tower looked at the man intently, and I asked if he could leave now. He looked sideways at the man and said that he was officially the head of the magic tower. Falahik said that he would personally handle this matter and that he should hide now. He knew that there was no need to find out anything. He knew that ever since the young lady was brought into the room in the corridor, the noise had not stopped. He understood perfectly well that in all likelihood the Duke himself was the culprit of the commotion. He thought for a moment and wondered if they were already on good terms, as he had heard that the couple had never gotten along. He thought it was very strange. He knew that the young lady was very sensitive to magic. He was surprised and did not understand why the Duke was okay. He wanted to find out from the other magicians about it later. He knew that he needed to take control of the situation right now. He slowly opened the door and froze in place in shock as he was engulfed in flames. The Duke in turn looked at the young man with fury. The young man looked at the Duke intently and said with a smile that the treatment was now over and he could go inside, and he also told the Duke that he had better put out the fire. The Duke in turn slowly put out the fire and everything returned to normal. The young sorceress looked at her colleague and asked for forgiveness. She said that she tried to stop him, but it was all in vain. He looked at her and said that everything was fine, and she did everything in her power. He looked at her intently and asked if it was enough for a magician to just do his best. He said that if she had put in all her efforts, there should be results. The young lady froze in place in surprise and shock. She did not know what to answer and was trembling with fear. A moment later, he came closer to her and quietly whispered that they would see each other in a few days in the room of silence. She froze in horror on the spot as she understood what he was talking about. Philaek looked at the Duke closely and said that he had cast restoration magic on his wife to help her regain her strength and had made arrangements so that she could sleep peacefully. The Duke looked at him closely and said that it seemed like his skills must be very good. He smiled and said that rather he had many interests and responsibilities, and he simply could not pass by people who were suffering from pain. The Duke looked at him closely and said that he seemed to be in a very close relationship with the owner of the tower, even helping with the treatment. The Duke looked at the young man with distrust and asked if mere interest was enough to engage in healing and be the right hand of the head of the tower. He looked at the Duke intently, and with an innocent smile said that if he was hinting at something then he should not worry. He was puzzled and did not understand why he had to justify himself to the Duke at all. He was furious because he knew that it was not his style to justify himself to pathetic people, but he knew that in order to avoid suspicion, he had to do it. He knew that he needed to be closer to them, especially since he liked the young lady. The Duke thanked the man for his help. He looked closely at the young wizard and said that he would now like to return to his chambers. He said that he would now go and call the young sorceress. The wizard smiled and said that the young lady had left on behalf of the head of the tower. He looked at the Duke with a smile and said that he would accompany them both until she returned. The Duke in turn slowly picked up his wife in his arms and carried her into the room. The young man looked at them intently and said with a smile that it was time for them to go. Some time later, the young lady woke up. She sighed heavily as she realized that her husband was not having an easy time. She knew that she usually fell ill once a year, and it just happened yesterday. She was a little worried because she didn't understand why her body suddenly became weak and her temperature rose. She didn't know at all why this happened. She knew that it didn't matter at all. She looked around for a moment because she didn't see her husband. She understood that since her husband was not in the room, she could steal the medicine. The young lady thought for a moment as she remembered that he had told her that she had to promise him that she would not wander alone in the magic tower as he was worried about her. She sighed heavily as she knew that she had already caused him a lot of trouble. She did not want to disturb him anymore. A moment later, she decided to take a look at the materials the prince had provided them. She wondered if the information given was comparable to what she had seen herself. She sighed heavily as she noticed that nothing matched. She knew that she would have to start from scratch. A moment later, Selena was taken aback as she heard some noise. She turned around and saw a young wizard. She was surprised as he entered the room without knocking. He looked at her intently and noticed with a smile that she was already awake. The young lady froze in surprise. She did not expect him to come to her. The Duke looked at the door in surprise as he realized that someone had entered their room. He was surprised and wondered who his wife was talking to so cheerfully. He wondered if it was really the one in the twice-as-magical tower with whom she could talk so cheerfully. He walked slowly into the room. The young lady greeted her husband with a smile. She looked at him intently and asked if he had met the admiral. She smiled and said that the young man told her about it. The Duke froze in place in surprise as he did not expect to see the young wizard with his wife Philaek, looked at the young lady with a smile and said that it was time for him to go. He looked at her intently and asked if she would take part in the evening reception. He slowly took her hand and with a radiant smile said that he would come to accompany them. A moment later, he tenderly kissed the hand of the young duchess. Selena was taken aback as she did not expect anything like that at all. He looked at the young lady with a smile and said that since he was accompanying the nobles, he decided to try to imitate their manners. He looked at the Duke with a smile and asked if it was similar to their manners. The Duke in turn looked at the young wizard with fury. He looked at the young lady angrily and asked her since when she had been close to the wizard. She looked at her husband in surprise as she did not understand what he was talking about. She said that it was not a very graceful way of addressing her. He looked at her with his fury and said that he did not want to behave politely with a suspicious type. Selena looked at her husband closely and said in bewilderment that she had been told that he had gone for the admiral. She said that was the reason the wizard had come to her room. He looked at her in surprise and asked if they hadn't said that magicians would only come when they were called. She said that the other nobles did not protest and demanded the mages to help them since there were no servants. He knew that many of the nobles never put on clothes on their own. He understood that this was quite expected since they could not stand the inconvenience even for a few days. She looked at her husband closely and said that it was very surprising that the Tower of Mages accepted this, since mages are known for their pride, and in the end they decided that they would help those who needed it. She looked at her husband closely and said that she had told them that she could do without it, and that if she needed help she would call Selena, asked her husband if he minded. She was very surprised and did not understand why he was looking at her like that. She sighed heavily and told her husband that if he wanted to say something he could say it. He looked at her intently and said that they had married without love, but they were still spouses and to others they should look like a loving couple. She sighed heavily and asked her husband how many times he had to repeat the same thing. He looked at her intently and said that it would turn out that she was starting to forget about it. She looked at him intently and said that his words sounded as if she had done something terrible. He said that this situation was very delicate because it could be misunderstood. He looked closely at his wife and said that the laughter could be heard even in the corridor, the Duke's wife and Poppy in the room without her husband, and laughter. He looked at her intently and asked if this wasn't great ground for gossip. She sighed heavily and said that let's say he was right. A moment later, the young lady asked her husband for forgiveness. She looked at him closely and asked if he was happy now. Selena said she would try not to be alone with him anymore. A moment later, she said he had promised to show her the tower. Millard looked at his wife with excitement and surprise and asked if she had already arranged a meeting with the magician. She sighed heavily and told her husband that as a duchess, she would not do anything that could put him in an awkward position. She showed her husband the scroll of silence. He looked at her in surprise and asked where she got the scroll from. She looked at him with a satisfied smile and asked if he really thought she had come to the tower unprepared. A moment later, the young lady activated the scroll of silence and, moving closer to her husband, said that Mac had told her something interesting. The Duke looked at his wife closely and said that she had used the scroll of silence. He looked at her closely and said that they were in the tower, and the scroll was only for peace, and there was no guarantee that it would work at all. She said that secret women's meetings were held in this tower. Selena said that these are unofficial women's parties that not many people know about. She said that she was just sure that she would find something there. Selena said that the banquet in the tower had started a week ago and the dates on the invitations were different, and it was very interesting that the difference was not a few days, but the term was a whole week, and they were the last guests. Selena looked at her husband closely and asked what everyone else had been doing in the tower all this time. The Duke thought for a moment as he realized that the Admiral had arrived at the tower a day before them. Millard knew that this was not a place that could be reached by horse or carriage. He knew that all the guests had been transported by magicians, and it was not a matter of distance. He wondered if this meant that the owner of the magic tower had decided the order in which the guests would arrive. He realized that the man did not look like a person who liked jokes or improvisation. She looked at her husband closely and said that something had been happening before they arrived and was continuing to happen, and they needed to find out what it was. He looked at his wife excitedly and called her. She looked at him intently and said that she was not asking permission, but was doing it for their promise. She knew that she would try to tell him about her plans if possible. She sighed heavily and said that it would be a women's-only meeting and there was nothing they could do. She said that if he wanted to join, he would have to dress up as a woman. The Duke sighed heavily and said that they could find another way. She looked at him and said that he just needed to know about it, and in the meantime she needed to get ready for the reception. She said that they could hurry. He sighed heavily but said nothing. The Duke asked his wife if she was ready. The young lady, excited, shouted to the Duke to wait a little as she was unable to button her dress. She was a little nervous because she needed to zip it up, but she couldn't reach it herself. Selena sighed heavily as she understood that she would not have time to change her outfit. She knew that she would have to call Millard. Looking out of the room, she called her husband. He looked at her in surprise and asked what had happened. The Duke asked his wife if she was ready to go out. She sighed heavily and said that she was not ready because she had a problem. He looked at his wife in surprise and asked what the problem was. She sighed heavily and asked him to zip up the zipper. He looked at her in surprise and asked what that meant. A moment later, he realized that there was a zipper at the back of the dress. He said sheepishly that he was entering the room. She looked sideways at her husband and said that she thought her dress was stuck and she couldn't button it. She asked for forgiveness and said that she needed help. The Duke froze in embarrassment when he saw her bare back. She looked at him in surprise and asked why he was standing there. She said that he should button up her outfit faster. He sighed heavily and agreed with her. He slowly reached out to the young lady and touched her back. She called out to him shyly. He sighed heavily and told her to stand still. A moment later, the Duke began to fulfill his wife's request. She asked her husband sheepishly if he was finished. He sighed heavily and sheepishly said that he was almost finished. A few minutes later, he said that everything was now ready. She sighed heavily and thanked him. He looked at his wife and said that she could go first as he would change and come. She looked at him in surprise and asked why he should do that as he looked good. A moment later, Millard pushed her out of the room and told her to go. Selena in turn froze in the corridor but was surprised and did not understand his behavior. Sometime later, the young people slowly descended and went to the ball. A moment later, they heard someone calling them. The Admiral looked at them intently with a smile on his face. He said that he was very glad to see them again. The Duke looked at him intently and said with a smile that he was very glad to see him and also introduced his wife. Her Nality said with a smile that it was a great honor for her to meet him, and she also introduced herself. The man looked at the Duke and said with a smile that it seemed that this was the same beauty he had told her about. He smiled, and looking at the Duchess said that she was indeed beautiful, as he had heard. She was surprised that her husband had told her about her. She thought that it was all because they had to play the role of lovers. They chatted happily for a while. The young lady looked back because she heard someone talking. A moment later, she saw the owner of the tower himself. The Admiral looked at the man closely and said that undoubtedly everything at the banquet was wonderful. He smiled and said that he was afraid that when he left the magic tower, he would become twice as big because of all the wonderful dishes. The wizard looked at them intently and said that if they did not mind, he would like to discuss magical support in the naval battle they had spoken of earlier. The Admiral arrived at the tower to receive magical support in controlling the wind for naval battles supporting the magicians. In the war meant direct interference in the politics of people. Everyone understood perfectly well that when the tower sent its people to war, the continent would plunge into bloody chaos. The Duke knew perfectly well that he had to keep a close eye on the relationship between the Admiral and the tower, and this was a direct order from the prince. He looked at them closely and agreed. He looked at his wife intently and asked if she could have some time alone. The young lady was taken aback, but a moment later said that he didn't need to worry about that. The wizard quickly approached them and looking at the young lady said with a smile that he would stay with her. She looked at the wizard in surprise as she did not expect to see him. The Duke looked at the young wizard with fury and anger. He quickly looked at his wife and asked if she could return to the room. She looked at her husband closely and said that there were a lot of people in the room and he didn't need to worry. Millard said that was exactly why he was worried. He said that everyone was looking at her. He looked at his wife intently and said that she should save her first dance for him. The young lady looked at her husband with embarrassment and agreed with him. She looked away from him in embarrassment because she knew that even though it was a game, she was very embarrassed when he spoke. The wizard looked at the young lady and said that she was receiving a lot of love. She looked at him in surprise and asked if this was abnormal. He looked at Selena intently and said that their relationship did not seem normal at all. He said that there were very few aristocrats who married for love. The young lady thought for a moment, as she had previously thought, that they were portraying an ordinary couple. He looked at the Duchess intently and said that since she could not dance and she did not enjoy food, he could show her the magic tower as he had promised her earlier. She thought for a moment. She remembered her husband telling her to be careful. She knew he was very worried about her, but she knew it was safe and she could protect herself. She smiled and said she was just starting to get bored. She smiled and said he could do her a favor. She looked closely, as it seemed to her that they had already walked along this path. She was very tired of the strange sights. She looked at the wizard intently and asked how much time had passed as she thought it was time for them to go back. He smiled and asked if she wasn't interested. He said with a smile that he still had a few perfect seats left that would suit the Duchess. He asked how about taking a last look at it. He came closer to her and quietly said that he would like to take her to the ladies' room that he had told her about earlier. He looked at her with a smile and said that since she was tired, They could go back. The young lady looked at him intently and said that she would like to see her. Selena looked at the wizard intently and said that her husband would be extremely worried about her. He looked at the young duchess with a smile and said that if she was worried that he would worry about that, she could look at the ball. He smiled and said that the duke was now very busy in a serious conversation with their master of the tower. She looked closely at the magic ball and realized that he was really busy. She sighed heavily and said that they could just leave for a little while. He smiled and said that she wouldn't regret it since all the girls really like it. She realized that he was showing the room to other women. She realized that he was friendly, not only with her. A moment later, the young man used magic, and they began to move to another room. The young lady looked at her friend with a smile and said that she drinks the wonderful medicine every day, and her skin is improving every day. She smiled and said that her mother said that her age spots had noticeably disappeared. A moment later, they did not start discussing this product. The young lady looked at the young ladies in bewilderment and asked what they had. She was very much surprised and amazed as she saw that the girl was becoming younger from taking the drink. He looked at the duchess with a sly smile and asked if it was not a beautiful sight. She froze in shock as she had never seen anything like it before. Since ancient times, the desire to remain young has been a constant goal of those in power. There were plenty of people willing to give whole bags of money for youth. Those who promised to return youth often turned out to be scammers, alchemists who sold the elixir of youth. The priests who promised to restore youth for generous donations were all swindlers, since it is impossible to turn back time, and it is also impossible to restore youth. The young lady was shocked. She did not understand how this was possible since her skin and hair had all returned to their previous state. Selena looked at the girls in surprise and asked if this was an illusion. The wizard smiled and said that of course it wasn't, since she had seen everything herself. And it was true. She thought for a moment and looked worried, saying that she had never heard of the magic that I use to restore youth. She said that even in myths, no one had the ability to rejuvenate or turn back time. She said that magic is a part of nature and one cannot go against the great laws of nature. The wizard smiled and told the duchess that it was not about returning youth. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he meant by that. A moment later, she froze in place as everyone stared at her. He smiled and said that it would turn out that they had been noticed and that they needed to move to another place. She was taken aback and looked at the wizard in surprise. Selena asked excitedly if she really shouldn't have come here. He smiled and said that only invited people could enter this room. She looked at him in surprise and asked why he had brought her to this room. Then he smiled and asked her why she thought he had brought her. A moment later, one of the ladies screamed and asked who was there. Selena flinched and froze in place. The young lady looked at them with fury and asked if they were invited too. She came closer to her with fury and asked how much the duchess had paid to get into this place. Selena froze in place in surprise. A moment later, the wizard used his magic. The young lady was surprised and did not understand where they had disappeared. Selena looked at the lady in surprise. She did not understand what was wrong with her. The wizard smiled and said that he had hidden their presence. Selena looked at the wizard with surprise and indignation and asked why he did that. She looked at him with fury and said that if anyone found out that she had secretly entered such a room, then there could be problems. He smiled and said that the survey wanted to become her friend. He looked at her closely and said that they say the easiest way to get close is to share secrets. He smiled and asked if that wasn't true. She thought for a moment about what he said. He looked at her intently and asked if she didn't like him. She looked at him in surprise and said that it was not that simple. She was curious why he wanted to be friends with her. He looked at her with a smile and asked if there were any good reasons for friendship. He looked at her intently and with a beaming smile said that for this reason he wanted to share an important secret with her. She looked at him and thought that it seemed he had no reason to lie. She wondered if he just wanted to win her affection. A moment later, she looked into the distance and saw several inconspicuous potions on the table. He smiled and said that she really had insight and could find treasures even among trash. Falahik said that her potion was given away. It was a healing potion. He said that the elixir of youth does not exist, and this potion simply heals damage and restores parts of the human body destroyed by time. He pouted and said that if the broken leg healed, no one would say that time had turned back or youth had returned. She looked at him in surprise and said that gray hair and wrinkles were not a disease. He said with a smile that it all depends on how they define the disease. Moments later, he took the knife in his hands and cut his palm. He looked at the young lady with a smile. He looked at her intently and said that she should look at it carefully. He said that he would now demonstrate why this potion is called healing. Selena was shocked by this. He slowly poured the healing potion onto his hand. He looked at the young lady with a smile and showed her his hand. He laid it on and asked what she would say to that. The wizard smiled and said that this was a cure, and it did not leave any scars at all. He smiled and said that the potion returns the body to its original permanent healthy state. He looked closely at the Duchess and said that to return to a full original state, this is the treatment. The young lady in turn thought for a moment and wondered if her brother was taking this potion. She wondered what would happen if her brother drank this potion. She was very interested in him as she hoped that he would make a full recovery. A moment later, the young lady called out to them. She was furious and did not understand why they were in the room without permission. The wizard was surprised as he realized that the spell hiding their presence had dissipated. He looked at the Duchess and said that it seemed that it was indeed time for them to leave. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was doing. He looked at her with a smile and said that he was asking her to leave. He said that they would leave quietly, as if they were not there. With the speed of lightning, he embraced the Duchess. She froze in surprise on the spot and could not utter a word. A moment later, the young man used his magic. After they moved to the Young League, she pushed him away and angrily asked what he was doing. He bowed with a smile and said that if there was noise, it would cause him a lot of trouble too. He said that if it upset her, then next time he would be more careful. He slowly approached her closer and quietly said that if she ever wanted to come back, she just had to let him know. The wizard grinned and said that he could always take her there. She shouted that if he dared to touch her again without permission, he would be in trouble. A moment later, the young woman and the Duchess were called by her husband. She was taken aback and looked at him in surprise. She froze and called out to her husband as she did not expect to see him in the corridor. He looked at the young people with fury. He was very angry because he saw that the wizard was touching his wife. With lightning speed, the Duke approached them and pushed the wizard away from his wife. He looked at the wizard with fury while slowly pulling his wife towards him. The Duke said that those who grew up and were educated in the Tower of Magicians apparently do not know what personal boundaries are. The young man looked closely at the Duke and asked with a smile how the conversation with the head of the tower had gone. The Duke said angrily that their conversation had gone well, and he also thanked them for their concern. He said that it was no longer necessary. The Duke said that the wizard should take them to the room. Millard looked at his wife with fury and said that she did not even hold out for a minute and immediately ran after the man. He shouted that they had just recently talked about how she should be more careful. He shouted that if anyone saw this, there would be gossip. She sighed heavily and said that she was very sorry. He looked at her closely and said that it looked like she had done something for which she should apologize. Selena looked at her husband closely and said that he was overreacting since nothing serious had happened. She said that they were just looking around the tower. Selena sighed and said that she could not tell her husband about this as he was busy talking with the owner of the tower. She sighed heavily and said that they had done nothing to humiliate the Duke's dignity. He looked at his wife with fury and asked if she really thought he was worried about some kind of dignity right now. Selena said that she knew that was exactly what he was worried about. He looked at her closely and asked if she really thought she knew what he was worried about right now. He sighed heavily and asked how she could know what he was worried about if he didn't know it himself. He sighed heavily and leaving told her to forget about it. She was surprised and looked after him intently. Sometime later, they sat quietly in the room. The young lady looked intently at her husband, who was sitting quietly on the sofa. She sighed heavily as she knew this couldn't go on. Selena knew perfectly well that she had to tell her husband about the healing magic she had seen. She wanted to ask her husband what he had talked about with the tower's master. The young lady slowly approached her husband. She looked at him intently and asked why he opened a book that he wasn't even reading. She looked at him intently and said that she was not being picky. He sighed heavily and without looking at her said that he was reading. She said that he was lying because he was not even turning the pages. He looked intently at his wife but did not answer. The Duke looked closely at his wife and asked if she had been following him all this time. She sighed heavily and said that she needed to talk to him. The young lady looked at her husband intently and said that she would like to apologize first. He sighed heavily and said that she kept saying that she was very sorry. He asked if she was truly sorry. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and asked if she could taste the wine. Selena knew she had done nothing to blame her for, but she knew that in order to complete the mission someone had to compromise. She knew that her husband was usually the one to make concessions. She understood that it was her turn now. She sighed heavily and asked for forgiveness. She said that she was really very sorry. A moment later, the Duke closed the book and told her to sit down next to him and they would talk. He looked at her intently. She was surprised as he pulled her hand, and she sat down next to him with a thud. He moved closer to her. Selena looked at her husband with embarrassment and called him. He looked closely at his wife and asked which side, right or left. Selena looked at him in bewilderment and asked what he was talking about. He looked at her intently and said that he was now talking about the place he touched. She froze for a moment as she did not expect such a thing. She looked at him in surprise and asked if they hadn't finished this conversation already. She sighed heavily and said that it wasn't that important. He looked into her enchanting eyes and said he wanted to know. She was taken aback and said that it seemed to be on the left. A moment later, he found the wizard's hair on her. He said jealously that he thought the wizard had only touched her with his hand, but it seemed that he had laid his head on her. He approached his spouse and said that the hair could only have stuck that way. He looked his wife in the eye with fury and asked what she was doing with the wizard. The young lady looked away in embarrassment and shouted that she hadn't done anything to him and that the hair had simply stuck to her during the teleportation. A moment later, he began to unbutton her dress. She was taken aback and asked in confusion what he was doing now. He looked at her intently and said that he needed to check everything. Sometime later, they moved to the bed. The Duke of Sonia tenderly kissed his wife. She was a little excited because he said he wanted to check something. She was surprised and didn't understand how they got to this point. She looked at him intently, for his warmth was very pleasant to her, and she did not want to push him away. A moment later, their gazes met. The Duke kissed his wife tenderly, and Selena reciprocated. Millard looked at his wife intently and said that she was still thinking about something else. He kissed her passionately and said that she needed to learn to concentrate on what was in front of her. The Duke kissed her again with tenderness and passion. She called him. The young lady was a little excited and didn't know what he was thinking about now. She wanted to know how he felt doing something like that. She wondered how she felt right now. She just wanted to end the fight with her husband and just calm him down. A moment later, the Duke called her, but she did not answer. The young man hugged the young lady tightly as he saw that she was ignoring his words. She froze in surprise for a moment as she did not expect such a thing. A moment later, she pushed him away and wondered when his feelings had become important to her. She looked at him intently and told him to get off as she needed to talk to him. She looked away from him and asked if he had calmed down yet. Selena sighed heavily as she thought that she must have gone crazy to bother him again. She thought that it must have been the tower where there was no one else but them. He sighed heavily and told his wife that he was not angry at all. He could not explain his feelings to her. A moment later, he asked with sadness in his voice what she wanted to talk to him about. Selena said that Falahik showed her something strange, and he gathered the ladies and sold them a potion. He was surprised because he did not expect such a thing. She said that the potion heals wounds instantly, and without a trace they called the potion a cure, but the ladies used it to maintain youth and beauty. The Duke was excited, looked at the young lady and said that it was simply impossible. She sighed heavily and said that she had seen it with her own eyes. He looked at her closely and said that maybe it was just an illusion. Selena sighed heavily and said that she knew he wouldn't believe her. She knew that ever since they arrived at the tower, he had been constantly watching her and trying to control her every move. She knew he was following her because he thought she might have made a mistake. She was puzzled because he never trusted her. He looked at his wife with alarm and said that she should not look for clues because it was simply impossible. She sighed heavily and said that just because something was impossible didn't mean it couldn't happen. Selena said that just like their marriage, it was entirely possible that there was a thing that could bring back youth. He looked at her intently, asking if she really thought their marriage was such a bummer. She said that if he didn't trust her, he could go and see for himself. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. He looked at her excitedly and asked if she knew how to get there. She smiled a sly smile and looked at her husband. She said that she was not that stupid. She asked her husband if he remembered the fairy tale where the characters scattered crumbs so as not to get lost. The young lady looked at her husband and said with a satisfied smile that she had done something similar. She showed him the small bottles and said that she had used magic dust made from her hair, and only she could see it. She looked at him closely and with a satisfied smile said that now he could just trust her and follow her. The Duke in turn slowly followed the young lady. She turned the corner with a victorious smile. He looked at her closely and smiled himself, as he had not seen her so happy for a long time. He wondered if he should just take her word for it. They doubted, he said with a smile, that they should go together. Moments later he froze in place in surprise as he saw that his wife was not there. He called her in surprise, but it was all in vain. She smiled and told her husband to listen to her. She said that she just couldn't do anything about it. She smiled contentedly and told him to wait a little while and she would show him that this product existed. She turned around excitedly because he didn't answer her. The young lady was very worried. She looked around but did not notice her husband. She looked intently at the corridor along which they had walked together a few minutes ago and called her husband, but he did not answer. She was very worried because she didn't understand where he had gone. She screamed, but there was no response. She understood that this simply couldn't be, that he had simply gone somewhere. She wondered if he had really gotten lost. She remembered the words of the young sorceress earlier. She told them that they cannot wander freely around the tower, since even the sorcerers themselves do not know all the spaces that were there. She sighed heavily because she understood that if this space of the tower was distorted, then she was lost. She wondered if she would never be able to go back. She was very worried that they would never see each other again. Selena sighed heavily. She knew that she needed to collect her thoughts. She understood that she had to find her husband and return to him. At the same time, the Duke stood quietly near the wall where he lost his wife. He sighed heavily and called her, but it was all in vain. He was very agitated as he understood that most likely due to the distortion of space, he lost sight of her. He was very afraid that she could simply get lost and end up in some dangerous place. He hoped that she would not look for him and would simply return to the room. He wondered if she had already done so. He sighed heavily and asked himself in confusion if he had really offended her. He was very sad because he did not know the answer to his question. The tower, which did not provide useful information, its owner who held him back, everything seemed very strange to him. The magician who constantly pursued his wife, and the tower itself which changed space, all this irritated him very much. He sighed heavily, knowing full well that he would eventually have to use some of his supplies. At the same time, the young lady was running through the corridors of the tower. She called out for her husband with fury as she did not understand where he was. She wondered if he was stuck in the tower forever. She was very worried and confused because she knew that if anything happened, she would only have herself to blame. She was very worried and thought that he simply shouldn't have been invited. She knew that she shouldn't have married him at all. She hoped that he would be safe. A moment later, she heard some noise in the distance. The young lady slowly turned around and looked down the corridor. She was excited and did not understand what she heard. It seemed to her that someone was in the corridor and someone needed help. Selena slowly walked to the door from where the noise was coming. She slowly entered the room as she thought that was where the long sound was coming from. Selena was worried as it was too dark there and she could not see anything. She didn't understand where she was at all. Suddenly, she heard someone calling her. The sorceress looked intently at the Duchess and asked if it was she. She froze in shock. She looked tremblingly at the young sorceress who was on the wall. The sorceress sighed heavily as she saw the Duchess in front of her. She was excited. She did not understand how she got to this place. The sorceress knew that the Chamber of Silence for the punishment of magicians was known only to a few, and those who knew about it were forbidden to talk about it. She was surprised and did not understand how an ordinary person like the Duchess could end up in such a place. The sorceress knew perfectly well that if anyone caught the Duchess, she would be in big trouble. She looked at the Duchess intently and told her to run away from the room immediately. She was shocked because she knew that the Duchess was frozen. Lilac screamed at the young lady to wake up immediately. She was excited and understood that they would all die. She did not understand how it happened. At the same time the Duke entered their room. The young lady looked at the Duke in surprise. He turned around and said it was him. He froze for a moment in surprise. He was surprised because he didn't expect to see something like this. The sorceress furiously screamed at the Duke to take his wife and leave immediately. The Duke quickly approached his wife and called her. He was very excited and frightened. He asked her if she was okay and if she was hurt. He shouted to his wife that it was very dangerous here. He shouted that she should stay close to him. Selena quickly fell into her husband's arms. He was taken aback and froze in surprise on the spot. He looked closely at his wife as he realized that she was trembling with fear. He said that they must go back. The Duke looked intently at his wife, who sat quietly. He slowly walked closer to her and called her. He was very worried about her condition. She sighed heavily and said that they needed to go back to this room, as she thought that they needed to save the sorceress who had become a test subject. He came closer to her and told her to speak quietly. The Duke said that they could not interfere in such matters. Now Selena was agitated, said that she could die. She asked if he really didn't care that a person could die. She screamed that if he couldn't help her, then she would save her herself. He looked at her intently and calmly said that if they were shrinking now, they could lose everything. He said that she shouldn't forget why they were. The Duke looked at the young lady sharply and said that they must proceed with caution. She, puzzled, said that he simply had not seen it. She said the young lady couldn't move and was being exploited. She said that the sorceress was in pain, and he did not see it. He sighed heavily and said that he saw it. She looked at him with fury and asked how he could remain calm after seeing everything. He was silent for a moment, not knowing what to answer. He knew that the experiments on living people that he read about in books were much worse and more terrible than he could have imagined. Millard knew that if this were happening on his lands or in his kingdom, he would immediately intervene. He looked at her intently and said that she should not forget that they were in a magic tower. He said that experiments on living people were an organized and carefully planned action, and only the head of the tower could lead it. He looked closely at his wife and said that the head of the tower knew about it for sure. Selena sighed heavily and told her husband that he was right. He looked at her puzzled and said that something like that could very well have happened in the Tower of the Magicians. He sighed heavily and told his wife to remember where they were going before finding the place she found. He looked at her worriedly and said that frankly they had no other choice and they should just rest today. The young lady slowly opened her eyes early in the morning. She looked at her husband and called him. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she was awake. For a moment, she remembered what she had seen and felt sick. She looked closely at her husband and asked if what had happened yesterday had been a dream. He sighed heavily and said that it had not been a dream. Selena sighed heavily and, without looking at her husband, said that they had agreed to deal with this today, so they should go. He looked at her with surprise and alarm and said that he needed to leave for a while. She looked at him with surprise, not understanding what he was talking about. She asked where he was going. She asked if he really wanted to meet the Admiral. Selena sighed heavily and said that if he was going to act alone, then she would do the same. He looked at her closely and said that he had already asked for breakfast to be brought to the room. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment. He said that the clothes she wore yesterday were dirty, so he burned them, and the magical artifacts that she had he removed. The young lady looked at her husband with fury and asked where he was going. He sighed heavily and said that he had been called in for questioning. The Duke said that while she was sleeping, the magicians came to them and they said that they had to conduct an investigation into the use of the magical artifact. She looked at him in surprise and said that she had just used the scroll of silence. She looked at her husband with surprise and alarm and asked if they had found out that they had wandered around the magic tower last night. She asked if they were now using this as an excuse to investigate. The Duke sighed heavily and said that it was not that he said that he was being questioned because of the thing that the prince had given him. The Duke said that there is a magical artifact that can find a person. It cannot find just anyone, and it can only be tuned to one person. She looked at her husband in surprise and asked if he had really used it to find her last night. He sighed heavily and said that that was exactly it. The young lady thought for a moment about what her husband had said. She was alarmed, wondering why it was she who had to be that person. She realized that the one who gave her husband this artifact was the prince. She understood that they knew about everything from the very beginning. She knew that now was not the time to ask questions. She wanted to know everything when he returned. She was alarmed, looked at him and asked if he was just going to be interrogated. The Duke smiled and came closer to her. He asked why she was so interested. He asked with a satisfied smile if she was really worried about him. She sighed heavily and looked away from him. She said that she was just worried because he used the artifact because of her. He gently stroked his wife's head. He looked at her intently and said that it was not because of her but because of him. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he meant by that. A moment later, the wizards entered their room and told the Duke to follow them. He looked at them intently and asked if he could have a little more time, as he wanted to say goodbye to his wife. The young people said that this was impossible, and they simply could not give him more time. The young lady in turn looked at the young men with fury. She did not understand what kind of attitude they were having towards them. The Duke saw her fury. He slowly approached her closer with a smile, asked if she knew that if she did anything here, it would only get worse. He looked at his wife intently and told her that she shouldn't make a scene. She looked at him furiously and wondered if he thought she was some kind of problem child. He turned around and said with a smile that he was leaving. She looked after him intently but said nothing. She looked at the wizard intently and said that her husband had been taken away by the mages, and as a message from the kingdom, she found it extremely unpleasant that they had arrested the Duke without any explanation. She said that she needed the details of what had happened. The Duke used a forbidden magical artifact. She realized that he hadn't been caught when he had been sneaking around the night before. She wondered if that could be considered lucky. She was worried because the men who came for her husband had treated him like a criminal in the morning. Selena knew that he was the head of the ducal family who was called the Pillar of the Kingdom, and he was a guest of the magic tower which possessed the power of the goddess. Philahik looked closely at the Duchess and said with a smile that she need not worry as the Duke would not be treated roughly. She cried out that of course it must be so. She cried out that the Duke was not a criminal. She looked closely at the wizard and said that the artifact he used did not cause any problems. He looked at the young lady closely and said that he understood that she was admitting that the Duke had brought an artifact with him. She said that the magic tower was full of artifacts, and she didn't understand why it was such a problem. Selena knew that since they arrived at the magic tower, the artifacts had been used more than once, but the problem only arose when the Duke used the artifact. The wizard said that the tower created magical artifacts, but they were simple and harmless things like the Scroll of Silence. He looked closely at the young lady and said that they were very reasonable people and would not make a fuss over such trifles. She realized that they knew about the use of artifacts. He said that the artifact that the Duke used yesterday, not everyone can create. It requires a lot of mana, and most importantly, the magic tower does not make such artifacts. He looked closely at the young lady and said that they were harmful to the health of the craftsmen who created the artifacts. She was surprised, did not understand why the prince gave the Duke such a dangerous artifact. She understood that before leaving he behaved very confidently and calmly, as if he knew that this would happen. She understood that he used the artifact to save her, knowing what it would lead to. She knew that if she had stayed there, then now she would be under investigation. She asked the wizard where the Duke was since she wanted to see him. He looked at her intently and said that if she wanted to see the Duke, she must tell him where she had been yesterday. The young lady looked at him intently and said that she simply did not understand what he was talking about. She sighed heavily and said that she had been in her room all day. He thought for a moment because he knew that she had definitely left the room yesterday, but he didn't know where she had gone. He knew that it was simply impossible to hide from his gaze in the tower, but yesterday he had missed the young lady. He was surprised and did not understand how she had hidden from him. She looked at her husband worriedly and asked what had happened. She wanted to know where he had been all day. She asked if he had been harmed. Selena looked at her husband in a hurry. She asked if he had been beaten. Millard looked at his wife with a satisfied smile and said that he was fine. He looked at her intently and said that it could be said that the matter was already decided. He said that he had not been beaten, and even if his body had been touched, he would not have remained indifferent. He looked at her intently and said that they needed to pack their things. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he meant. She wanted him to explain everything to her in more detail. He said that he admitted to using the forbidden artifact, only a teleportation device. He sighed heavily and said that they didn't know exactly what kind of artifact he used, and they only knew that it existed. The Duke said he had told them he had lost his way on his way to the Admiral's to have some good wine. She asked in surprise if they had believed him. The Duke sighed heavily and said that of course they did not believe it. He said that they could do nothing and could not torture him. He asked what she had been doing all day. She sighed heavily as she did not know when he would return, and for this reason had spent the whole day in the room. She sighed heavily and said that she hadn't done anything special. She asked what he had decided about the investigation. He said that they had offered him several options. He looked at his wife intently and said that either they would erase his memory or he would leave the tower immediately. She was excited as she did not expect to hear such a thing. The Duke said that there is a penalty for illegally importing magical artifacts. They can completely erase the offender's memory or expel him from the tower. He said that when they offered to erase his memory, he entered into a pointless argument and pretended to be ready to compromise. The Duke said that he agreed to leave the tower. He said that if they didn't like it, they could formally complain to the king and he would demand that he be punished. He said that only the king could punish him because he was a duke. She sighed heavily and said that it looked like they would be leaving the tower tomorrow. He said that was exactly it, and they only had a little time left. The Duke looked intently at his wife and called her. He smiled and asked if she had rested enough today. Millard said that when he was interrogated, he noticed traces of magical research in their rooms. He said that if they searched the rooms, they might find some clues. Selena said they should try. She was excited and didn't know what excuse they would use to get there. A moment later, the Duke grabbed his wife, pinned her against the wall, and kissed her passionately. They wanted to act brazenly, namely to imagine that they are lovers blinded by passion, and they urgently need a place to remove their desires, or they are like a couple who want to spend their last night in the Tower of Magicians in a peculiar way. Curiosity, a thirst for adventure, characteristic of a couple visiting an unfamiliar place, they knew that this was quite plausible. Selena looked closely at her husband, wondering if their plan would work. A moment later, the Duke kissed his wife passionately. She slowly pushed him away and sighed heavily, saying that she couldn't breathe. Millard looked at her and asked if she was really thinking about something else again right in front of him. He looked at his wife intently but with embarrassment and said that she was simply shameless. A moment later, he kissed her again with passion. She screamed for him to wait a little, but to no avail. She knew it was just an act, but she didn't understand why he was so insistent. She pushed him away and asked how much longer this would go on. He looked back and, sighing heavily, said that it was time for them to finish. A few minutes later, they entered the laboratory. She hoped that they would find something in it. She looked at her husband and said that she would start the search on one side and he on the other. Sometime later, they began searching the laboratory. The young lady found some kind of scroll. She looked closely at the piece of paper. He looked very familiar, and she didn't know where she had seen something like this before. The Duke looked at his wife and asked if she had found anything. She was taken aback as she had not expected him to ask her a question. She quickly hid the sheet and said that she had not found anything yet. He came closer to her and told her to be quiet as he thought he heard someone coming. A moment later, they heard conversations. The young lady quickly grabbed her husband's hand. He looked at her in surprise. The wizard slowly entered the room, continuing their conversation. The wizard entered the room and froze at what he saw. He was taken aback when he saw a young couple kissing. He looked at them in surprise and asked excitedly what they were doing here. The Duke said with a smile that it seemed that even the wizards had fallen for their trick. The young lady smiled and said that it seemed to be true. She smiled and said that it seemed like they had made progress since they had found the potion. But unfortunately, they didn't find out anything else. He sighed heavily and said that they had little time. He looked at his wife with a smile and said that even this would be enough since the potion was not easy to obtain. He said that they almost left empty-handed, and he did not have time to take anything. She hoped that they would not reveal them. He said that it was their own fault because they did not close the door. He smiled and said that everything would be fine. He looked at his wife with a soft smile and said that she did not need to worry. He looked at her intently and said that it was time to leave the Tower of the Magicians. She was surprised as a lot had happened in a short time. The prince looked closely at the newlyweds and greeted them with a smile. He said that they had returned earlier than he expected. He smiled and said that they looked rested. He asked if they had good news for him. He looked closely at the young men and said that judging by their faces, something had happened in the tower. A moment later, they provided the prince with potions. He looked at them intently with a smile on his face. He asked in surprise if they really stole him like that. He looked at them closely with a satisfied smile and said that it seemed like they had become closer. Selena sighed heavily and told her husband that they had agreed to keep this quiet. The Duke said that they still needed to seek help. She looked at the prince closely and said that she had seen the effect of the potion herself, and it really did work. He looked at her with alarm and said that he did not doubt her words at all. Considering where they got it from, they were obliged to subject everything to a thorough check. She reached for the potion and said that if they did not believe her, then she would now test it on herself. The Duke stopped his wife. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really wanted to cut her hand and pour the potion on it. Selena said that this was the surest way to show it in action. The prince looked at them intently for some time as they quarreled among themselves. The prince looked at her and said that they believed her, but this remedy could be dangerous, and for this reason she should not take risks. He looked at them closely and asked if they had such a product, what would they make first? The Duke said that of course he would heal the sick. Selena thought about it and said that they could heal the wounded soldiers. The Duke looked at the prince and said that they could heal them and send them back into battle. He was taken aback and froze in shock after what he himself said. A moment later he remembered the admiral whom they had seen in the tower. Now he understood everything. Millard said that when he watched them in the tower, it was noticeable that the admiral had asked for their support too easily. Now he realized that what they really needed was the potion. He understood that they wanted to get him in order to maintain control of the sea. The prince looked at them and said that while they were gone, he had managed to find out something, and he had learned that the first people who had escaped death had been discovered in the port. Selena asked in surprise if the new medicine could really resurrect the dead. He said that if you pour this potion on a dead person, it can bring him back to life. The prince asked the young lady what she thought about this. She thought for a moment and said that it might be like turning back time. She said that if you give this potion to a dead person, he will be able to come back. The Duke thought for a moment about what his wife had said. He said that those they saw looked too strange to say that they had returned to their previous state. She looked at him closely and said that it might be a side effect. She said that it looked like they would have to do an experiment. Leonardo sighed heavily and said that if the young lady's theory was correct, then they would actually create one who could escape death. The prince looked at them intently and said that he did not know whether it was right or not, but they could not let it go at the moment, because if they abandoned this matter, then the capital would face a catastrophe. She looked at him intently and said that they could conduct experiments on their estate. She said that the product given away seemed to work on all living things, and for that reason they could try it on dead plants or animals. She looked at him and said that she understood his concerns perfectly well, but she believed that they needed to confirm its effectiveness. The prince looked at the young lady intently and said that they could do so. The Duke in turn said that he also agreed. True, there was too little potion for many experiments. He thought that they needed to steal more. The young lady said they could make a replica of it. The prince thought about it and said that they should try it. The lady said that they could share the potion, and while the prince tested the possibility of a copy, they could begin experiments. The young lady looked at her husband and said with a smile that they could start an experiment. He smiled and said that he agreed with her. The prince said that it was already decided and he would wait for the results. He looked closely at the young lady and asked if she had found the item she was going to steal. She hesitated, not knowing what to answer to this question. The Duke glanced sideways at his wife as he was also interested in this question. Sometime later, they were already on their territory. She looked at the beautiful house as she found it hard to believe that it was now her home. Everything seemed very strange to her. A moment later, she heard someone calling her and turned around. The young people looked closely at the Duke and Duchess and greeted them. The maid looked at her mistress with alarm. She could not understand how they could be treated badly in the magic tower. Selena froze for a moment as she didn't expect anything like this. She saw that the atmosphere was different, not like in her native estate. A moment later, the young man ran up to the Duke and shouted that he was very bored. He looked at the Duchess intently and said that knowing that they had just returned, he would like to borrow the Duke for a few minutes, as he had something to tell the Duke. The young lady was surprised, but still agreed with him. The Duke looked at his wife intently and asked for forgiveness, saying that he needed to leave first. He smiled and said that she should just wait until dinner and rest. She smiled and wished him luck. The young lady looked closely at her husband. She thought that getting used to this place would be much easier than she thought. The young lady slowly woke up and, looking at the maid, asked if it was already morning. The maid smiled and said that it was already morning. Selena was surprised, as she had slept for a very long time. The maid looked at her mistress and said that the Duke would like to have breakfast with her this morning. She asked what to answer. The maid said that he said he would wait until she woke up, but she thought she might be uncomfortable. Selena smiled and said she would go. The maid was surprised. She looked closely at the mistress and asked in bewilderment, was she really going to go? For some time, the maid asked the mistress again, was this really true? Selena smiled and said that she would go to breakfast. The maid said with a joyful smile that she would go and quickly report everything to the Duke. Anna thought that her mistress would definitely refuse this, but now she understood that they had become closer after the magic tower. The Duke sat at the table waiting for his wife. He looked closely at the documents. Selena slowly entered the room and looked at her husband in surprise. She said that he should have had breakfast already. He said that since she was here, they could eat. Without looking up from the documents, he said that she had begun to sleep more lately. He asked if her stamina had decreased. He also asked about exercise. He suggested that she take short walks around the area. A moment later, the young lady snatched the papers from his hands and said that he would do well to learn his table manners again. He looked at her in surprise, but a moment later said that he would take care of it. The Duke asked his wife what her plans were for today. She sighed heavily and said that she had no plans. The servants watched their sweet squabble and were a little puzzled by their conversation. The Duke looked closely at his wife and said that if she had no plans, she could go hunting with him. She looked closely at her husband as she realized that he meant finding a suitable test subject for them. Sometime later, they were already hunting. She sighed heavily and, looking around, told her husband that they were far enough away. He said that today they would not hunt big game rabbits, or petting would be enough. Selena shouted to her husband and told him in which direction the rabbit ran. A moment later, the Duke fired and killed the rabbit. The young lady sighed heavily and looked intently at the rabbit. The Duke in turn looked intently at his wife. He sighed heavily and said that they must do it. Selena looked at him intently and said that he could go back first. Millard asked in confusion where she was going. She sighed heavily and, looking away from him, said that she was going to stop by home for a while. He looked at her in surprise and said that her home was here. He said that if she was going to her father's estate, then she could take him with her. She said that everything was fine, she would go there herself. She said he had a lot to do already. He said that even if he was busy, it was his duty to find time for her. She said that everything was fine and he didn't need to go with her. Selena looked at him intently and said that she would go alone. He looked at her intently as if he knew that what had been between them was starting again. He understood that as soon as they became closer to each other, the distance between them increased again. He sighed heavily and, as he left, said that she could do as she wanted. Selena looked after him with surprise and sadness. She wanted to stop him but still let him go. She wondered what was the point of stopping him now, since she had said herself that he could not go with her. She knew that she had to go alone. She knew that if she went to her father's estate today, she would immediately be sent to the basement. She could not show such a thing to her husband. Sometime later, she came to her father and greeted him. He looked angrily at his daughter and said nothing. The servant looked at the master and asked if he should bring him some tea. The man told his subordinate that they didn't need anything and sent him away. The young lady looked at her father intently. He said that he heard that she had recently gone to the magic tower. He asked if she had managed not to disgrace herself there. Selena sighed heavily and said that she had not done anything there. He looked at her intently and said that he really hoped that these were not empty words. He shouted that she should not even tarnish his reputation. A moment later, he stood up and said that she should follow him. Selena was puzzled and could not believe that she was willingly returning to hell again. She knew that she had to do it for her brother. He pushed her and told her to come in faster. He looked at his daughter with fury and contempt and shouted that she belonged in his house. He screamed that she would stay here, paying with her blood for the rest of her life. The young lady in turn understood perfectly well that she had no choice, and she had to do it. She knew perfectly well that if her husband found out about this, he would do everything to protect her. The young man looked at the young lady intently and greeted her with a smile. He asked how she had chewed all this time. He looked at her closely, said that she had lost a little weight. He said that she should eat well and rest more. She quickly rolled up her sleeve and said that they had to get this over with quickly. The wizard looked at her intently and thanked her with a smile. He said that thanks to her cooperation, they finished very quickly. She sighed heavily and said that she thought she would see him in the magic tower. He said that he had heard about her recent visit to the tower. He asked if she liked it there. The young lady looked at the young wizard and asked if he had ever met the head of the tower. He looked at her and said that the head of the Tower of Mages was indeed an outstanding person.